Imagine a cold grey sea. Imagine a wide northern ocean at the end of a long day. The water the colour of iron and slate, heaving slowly under a low sky. The swell rising and falling in great smooth hills of grey-green water that catch the last pale light of a sun already sinking toward the rim of the world. Imagine the wind coming steady out of the north, cold and clean and tasting of salt and far-off ice, and the spray blowing off the crests of the waves in long pale streamers, and the gulls wheeling and crying, and then falling silent as the light fails. Imagine a coastline of dark rock and steep green mountains plunging straight down into deep blue water, the fjords of the north, narrow arms of the sea reaching far inland between sheer stone walls, still and black and mirror-smooth in their depths, while the open sea labours and heaves beyond their mouths. Imagine the first stars pricking through the deepening blue overhead, and far to the north, low on the horizon, a faint green shimmer beginning to move across the sky. The northern lights, the aurora, the cold fire of the high latitudes, curtains of pale green and silver light rippling silently over the top of the world. And imagine, far out on that cold grey heaving sea, in the last of the light, a single ship, a long, low, narrow ship, beautiful and deadly, its hull built of overlapping oak planks that flex and breathe with the swell, its single great square sail of woven wool bellying out red and grey against the darkening sky, its high prow rising and curving up and forward into the carved head of a dragon or a serpent, gazing out across the water toward whatever lies beyond the horizon. Imagine the long line of round shields fixed along its side, the steady rhythm of the oars when the wind drops, the figures of the men aboard, bearded, weathered, wrapped in wool and leather against the cold, watching the sea and the sky with the calm, hard patience of people who have made the open ocean their road. Imagine that ship driving on through the dusk and into the night, out across waters that no one before them had dared to cross, toward coastlines that had never seen such a vessel, carrying with it a people who, for 3 extraordinary centuries, would range farther and strike harder and reach wider than anyone could have imagined, from the monasteries of Britain to the rivers of Russia, from the markets of Constantinople to the shores of a new world across the Western Ocean that no European had ever seen. These were the Vikings, the seafaring people of the Scandinavian North, the Norse, the men and women of Denmark and Norway and Sweden, who in the years around the end of the 8th century burst suddenly out of their cold northern homeland and onto the stage of history, and who for the next 300 years would terrify, trade with, raid, settle, and reshape much of the known world. Tonight we will follow them, out of the fjords and across the cold grey sea, on the long road of their extraordinary age. We will stand on the shore of a quiet island monastery as the first dragon-prowed ships come out of the dawn, and feel the shock that ran through all of Christendom at the coming of the Northmen. We will sail with them down the coasts of Europe, up its rivers, across its narrow seas, to England and Ireland and Francia, to the great city of Constantinople, to the rivers of the Russian forests where they founded the first Russian state. We will cross the open Atlantic with them to the empty volcanic island of Iceland, where they built a free society unlike any other in their world, on to the icebound coasts of Greenland, and at last across the last stretch of unknown ocean to the shores of North America, 500 years before Columbus. And we will go deeper than the raids and the voyages, into the inner world of the Norse, into the cold and magnificent mythology that they carried in their hearts, the great cycle of stories about their gods and their cosmos, that is one of the most powerful and haunting bodies of myth the world has ever known. We will climb the great World-Tree Yggdrasil that holds the 9 worlds in its branches and roots. We will meet one-eyed Odin, the Allfather, the god of wisdom and war and poetry and death, who hung himself upon the tree for 9 nights to win the secret of the runes. We will meet red-bearded Thor with his hammer, the thunder god, the protector of gods and men. We will meet cunning, treacherous Loki, the trickster who would bring about the end, and we will hear the greatest and darkest of all their stories, Ragnarök, the doom of the gods, the foretold battle at the end of the world, in which the gods themselves go down fighting, knowing they cannot win, against the forces of fire and chaos and the great wolf and the world serpent, for that is the heart of the Viking spirit, and the thread that runs through everything we will follow tonight. A people who lived hard and bravely in a hard cold land at the edge of the world, who took to the sea and dared the unknown, who built a mythology of magnificent and tragic courage, gods who face their own doom without flinching, heroes who seek glory in the teeth of a fate they cannot escape. Theirs was a world of iron and cold and salt water, of long winters and short summers and the green fire in the northern sky, of courage and cruelty and craft and wonder. And tonight we will wander through the whole of it, the entire story of the Vikings, from the first raid to the last king, from the creation of the world out of fire and ice to its destruction at Ragnarök, on the long road across the cold grey sea. So let the night come down over the northern ocean. Let the green fire ripple silently across the top of the sky. Let the long ship drive on through the darkening water, the dragon prow lifting and falling against the stars. And let us follow it, out of the fjords and into the wide world, into the age of the Vikings, and begin. Before we follow the Vikings out across the sea, we must understand the land that made them. For the Norse were shaped by their homeland as surely as any people in history, and the hard cold geography of Scandinavia explains a great deal about why they became what they became. To understand the Vikings, you must first stand in the north and feel the land beneath your feet. Scandinavia is the great northern peninsula of Europe, together with the flat lands of Denmark to its south, the modern countries of Norway, Sweden and Denmark, the Viking homelands. It is a land that lies far to the north, reaching up toward the Arctic Circle and beyond it, a land of long dark winters and brief bright summers, of cold and snow and ice, of a sun that in the depths of winter barely rises above the horizon and in the height of summer barely sets. It is, much of it, a hard land, and the hardness of it pressed upon the people who lived there and shaped the course of their history. Norway, in the west, is a land of mountains and fjords, a long, narrow country of steep stone mountains running down to a coastline so cut and broken by the deep, narrow sea inlets called fjords, that its true length, measured around every inlet, is many thousands of miles. It is beautiful and dramatic and harsh, a land where the mountains come down almost to the sea, and the strips of farmable land are narrow and precious, wedged between the steep slopes and the deep water. In such a land, with so little good farmland and so much rugged coast, the sea was not a barrier but a road. The easiest way to travel was by boat, along the coast and across the inlets, and the people of Norway became, of necessity, a people of the sea, skilled in boats and seamanship from the cradle. And when their population grew and the narrow strips of farmland could no longer feed everyone, the sea offered the only way out, a way, across the water, to find new land or new wealth elsewhere. Sweden, to the east, across the mountainous spine of the peninsula, is a somewhat gentler land of forests and lakes and a long coastline facing the Baltic Sea, and the Baltic, and the great rivers that flowed into the lands to the east and south, would draw the Swedes eastward, into the forests and rivers of what would become Russia, and on toward the rich and distant markets of the east. And Denmark, to the south, is different again. A land not of mountains, but of low, flat, fertile islands and peninsulas, controlling the narrow straits between the Baltic and the North Sea, the gateway between the Scandinavian world and the rest of Europe. The Danes, closest to the wealthy lands of Christian Europe and commanding the sea lanes, would look south and west, toward England and Francia and the rich pickings of the continent. So the three peoples of the north were shaped by their three lands toward three directions: the Norwegians west across the open Atlantic, the Swedes east into Russia, the Danes south into Europe, and together they would reach across half the world. But they shared a common world, a common language, the Old Norse tongue, from which the modern Scandinavian languages descend, a common religion, the worship of the Old Norse gods, of Odin and Thor and the rest, a common culture of farming and seafaring and warrior honor, a common law and custom and way of life. They were not a single nation. There was no Norway or Sweden or Denmark yet as unified kingdoms, but rather a patchwork of small territories, of local chieftains and petty kings, of independent farmers and warrior aristocrats. But they were one people in language and gods and culture. The people of the north, the Norse, and the wider world, when it met them, would come to call them by another name, the Vikings. The word itself is debated. To go Viking in the Old Norse meant to go raiding, to go on an expedition by sea in search of plunder and adventure and wealth. And a Viking was one who did so. It was a thing you did, not only a people you were. A man might go Viking in the summer and return to his farm in the autumn, but the wider world applied the name to the whole people of the north who came out of the sea. And so it has come down to us, the Vikings, the seafarers of the north, the people of the cold grey sea. And around the end of the 8th century, for reasons we will explore, they began to come. Before the Vikings became raiders in the eyes of the world, they were simply the Norse, farmers and fishermen and traders and craftsmen, living their lives in their cold northern homeland in the centuries before the great age of expansion began. And to understand them, we should pause here, before the first ship appears out of the dawn, and look at the world they lived in before the storm broke, the ordinary, settled, working world of the Norse farmer, the foundation beneath the legend of the Viking raider. The Norse were, first and above all, farmers. For all the fame of their raiding and seafaring, the great majority of them lived their whole lives on the land, working the soil, raising animals, bound to the slow rhythm of the northern seasons. A Norse farm was a self-sufficient little world, a long timber hall where the family lived, with a central hearth running down its length and benches along the walls for sitting and sleeping, surrounded by outbuildings and barns and the fields and pastures that fed the household. They grew what grain they could in the short, cool growing season, barley above all, for bread and for the ale that was central to their feasting, oats and rye. They raised cattle and sheep and goats and pigs, which gave them meat and milk and wool and leather. They fished the rich northern waters and hunted in the forests and the mountains. It was a hard life of constant labour, especially through the long dark winters, when the animals had to be kept alive on stored fodder and the household lived on what had been preserved through the autumn slaughter. But it was a life that, in good years, could support a proud and independent people. And the Norse were a proud and independent people, for theirs was a society that, by the standards of the time, gave a remarkable degree of freedom and standing to the ordinary free farmer. At the heart of Norse society was the free man, the bondi, the independent farmer who owned his own land, bore his own weapons, answered to no lord but managed his own affairs, and took his place as an equal among other free men at the assembly. Above the free farmers stood the aristocracy, the jarls, the chieftains and warrior nobles and petty kings, the wealthy and powerful who commanded followings of warriors and led in war and raiding. And below the free men stood the unfree, the thralls, the slaves, who did much of the hard labour and who had few rights, a reminder that this was also a harsh and hierarchical world. But the free farmer at the centre of it all was a figure of real dignity and independence, and Norse society was governed not only by kings and chieftains, but by law and assembly, by the Thing, the gathering of free men that made laws, settled disputes, and gave the Norse a tradition of law and collective decision that was one of the most distinctive features of their world. It was also a world governed by honour, by reputation, by the good name a man or woman left behind, by the obligations of kinship and the duty of vengeance. In a society with no strong central state, no police, no organised system of justice beyond the assembly and the feud, a person's safety and standing depended on their reputation and their kin, on being known as someone not to be crossed, someone whose family would avenge a wrong. And so honour was everything. To be shamed, to be insulted, to suffer a wrong unavenged, was a kind of social death, and the blood feud, the cycle of vengeance between families, ran through Norse life and through the great Norse sagas that remember it. To live well was to live with honour, and to die well, bravely, facing one's fate without flinching, was the finest thing of all, the thing their gods and their warriors most admired. This, then, was the Norse world before the Viking Age, a hard, cold land of independent farmers and proud warrior aristocrats, bound by kinship and honour and law, worshipping the old gods, working the land and sailing the sea, living and dying by a fierce code of courage and reputation. It was a world that had existed, in its essentials, for a long time, turning slowly through its seasons at the cold edge of Europe, little known to and little concerning the wider world to the south. And then, around the end of the 8th century, something changed, and the Norse came pouring out of their homeland, and the world would never be the same. Why it happened when it did is one of the great questions of history, and we will come to it. But first, we must understand the thing that made it all possible, the single most important Viking achievement, the technological marvel without which there would have been no Viking Age at all, the ship. If you want to understand how a scattered people from the cold edge of the world came to range across half the globe, you must understand their ships, for the Viking ship was the foundation of everything, the technological masterpiece that made the whole Viking Age possible, and one of the most beautiful and effective vessels ever built by human hands. Without the ship, there is no Viking Age. With it, the Norse could go anywhere the water reached, and the water reached almost everywhere. The most famous of the Viking ships was the longship, the sleek, fast warship that carried the raiders across the sea, the dragon-proud vessel that struck terror into the coasts of Europe. The longship was a marvel of design, the product of centuries of refinement, perfectly adapted to its purpose. It was long and narrow and low in the water, built for speed and for striking power. Its hull was built in the clinker style, of overlapping planks of oak riveted together and fastened to a light internal framework. A method that produced a hull both strong and remarkably flexible, able to flex and twist with the waves rather than fighting them, riding the swell like a living thing. It was light enough that its crew could drag it up onto a beach, or even carry it overland between rivers, and this was crucial, for it meant the longship was not confined to the open sea, but could be run straight up onto any shore, could penetrate far up shallow rivers, could appear suddenly where no one expected a ship to reach. It had a single mast carrying a large square sail, usually of heavy woven wool, that drove it before the wind at impressive speed. And when the wind failed, or the situation demanded, it had oars all along its length, so that the crew could row it with precision and power, into the wind, up a river, onto a beach, in a dead calm. Sail and oar together gave the longship a flexibility no other vessel of its age could match. And it was shallow of draught. It sat high in the water, drawing only a few feet, so that it could cross shallow coastal waters and run up rivers that would have grounded any deeper ship. This shallowness, combined with the ability to row and to beach the ship anywhere, was the secret of the Viking terror. The longship could appear out of the open sea, run straight up onto an undefended beach or far up an inland river, disgorge its warriors, and be gone again before any defense could be organized, striking from the sea like lightning, unpredictable, almost impossible to defend against. The monasteries and towns of Europe, used to threats coming slowly over land, had no answer to an enemy that could come out of the water anywhere, at any time, and vanish back into it. The longships came in various sizes, from smaller vessels carrying a few dozen men to the great warships of kings, carrying 100 or more, and the largest and finest were magnificent things, richly carved and decorated, their high prows rising into the carved heads of dragons or serpents that gave them their fame and their fear, the dragon ships, the serpent ships, gliding out of the mist with their carved monsters gazing forward. To the Norse, the ship was not merely a tool but an object of pride and beauty, and even reverence. The finest were treasured, named, celebrated in poetry. Great chieftains were buried in their ships, laid to rest in the vessel that had carried them in life, to sail on into the next world. The ship was the center of the Viking world, the source of their power and their wealth and their fame, the beautiful deadly instrument of their age. But the longship was only one of the Norse vessels. Alongside the sleek warship was its broader, deeper cousin, the nar, the cargo ship, the merchant vessel, wider and higher-sided and deeper of hull, built to carry not warriors but goods and livestock and settlers and their possessions across the open ocean. It was the nar, not the longship, that carried the Norse settlers and their cattle and their goods across the wild North Atlantic to Iceland and Greenland and the shores of the New World. A tough, capacious, seaworthy ocean crosser, less famous than the dragon ship, but just as important, the vessel of the explorer and the settler and the trader. Together, the swift longship of the raider and the sturdy nar of the merchant and settler gave the Norse mastery of the water in all its forms, the coastal raid and the ocean crossing, the river penetration and the trading voyage, and made possible the whole extraordinary reach of the Viking age. The Vikings had the ships, but a ship is only as good as the people who sail it, and the seamanship of the Norse, their ability to navigate the open ocean, to cross hundreds of miles of empty water and arrive where they intended, was every bit as remarkable as the vessels themselves, and even more mysterious, for they did it without any of the instruments that later sailors would consider essential. How the Vikings crossed the open North Atlantic, out of sight of land for days on end, and found small islands in the vastness of the ocean, is one of the wonders of their age. They had no compass, in the early centuries, no magnetic needle to show them north. They had no charts of the open ocean, no accurate clocks to help reckon their position, none of the navigational science that would come later. What they had instead was an extraordinary accumulated knowledge of the sea and the sky, passed down and refined over generations, a practical seamanship so deep and so sure that it allowed them to cross oceans by reading the world around them. They navigated by the sun and the stars, by the height of the sun at noon, which told them how far north or south they were, and by the stars at night, the fixed pole star showing them north. They sailed, when they could, along lines of latitude, running north or south along the coast, until they reached the latitude of their destination, then turning and sailing due east or west along that latitude, keeping the sun and stars at the right height, until they struck their goal. They read the sea itself, the colour and temperature of the water, the patterns of the swells and currents, the kinds of seaweed floating past. They read the sky, the clouds that gather over land unseen below the horizon, the light reflected up from ice or from Greenland, and they read the life of the ocean, the birds above all, whose flight at evening pointed toward the land where they roosted, so that a navigator might carry birds aboard and release them to show the way to shore. The whales and the fish, whose presence spoke of the waters they swam in. It was a navigation of deep knowledge and keen observation and hard-won experience, a reading of the whole book of the sea and sky and the life within them, and it allowed the Norse to do what no other Europeans of their age could do, to strike out across the open ocean, out of all sight of land, and to find their way. They called the sea the whale road, the swan's path, the road of the whales, for to them it was indeed a road, a highway, the way to wealth and land and adventure and fame, and they travelled it with a confidence and a reach that astonished the world. With these ships and this seamanship, the Norse held the keys to the water, and around the year 793 they turned those keys, and the age of the Vikings began, not gently, not as traders or settlers, but in fire and blood, with a raid that sent a shock of terror through all of Christian Europe. It came out of a clear summer sky, in the year 793, on a small holy island off the northeast coast of England, and it sent a shock through all of Christendom that echoed for centuries. The place was Lindisfarne, the Holy Island, one of the most sacred sites in all of Britain, a tidal island cut off from the mainland at high water that held a famous monastery, a centre of Christian learning and holiness, a quiet community of monks living their lives of prayer and study, rich in the treasures of their faith, gold and silver, jewelled books, the relics of saints, and utterly undefended, for who would attack a house of God on a remote island at the edge of the world? The Northmen would. Out of the sea, without warning, the dragon-proud ships came, and the warriors leapt ashore and fell upon the monastery in an orgy of slaughter and plunder. They killed the monks or carried them off as slaves. They tore the treasures from the altars and the shrines. They seized the gold and silver, defiled the holy places, and were gone again across the water before any help could come, leaving the sacred island a smoking ruin. The chroniclers of the time recorded it with horror and disbelief. A contemporary scholar wrote that never before had such a terror appeared in Britain, that the heathen had trampled the holy place, that the Church of God had been spattered with the blood of its priests, stripped of its treasures. It was not merely the violence, terrible as it was the sacrilege, the unthinkable assault on the holiest of places by men who cared nothing for the Christian God, who saw a defenceless treasure house and took it. To Christian Europe, it was as if the order of the world had been overturned, as if a door had opened onto chaos, and the raid on Lindisfarne was only the beginning, the first crack of a storm that would break over Europe and last for generations. In the years that followed, the raids multiplied and spread. The monasteries of Britain and Ireland, rich and undefended and clustered along the coasts and rivers, were perfect targets, and the Vikings fell upon them again and again. Iona, the great holy island of the Scots, raided and raided again. The monasteries of Ireland plundered up and down the coasts and far up the rivers. The holy places of England and Scotland struck without warning out of the sea. Year after year, the dragon ships came with the summer, and the cry went up along the coasts. The Northmen, the Heathen, the Vikings, and the people fled inland or died or were carried off, and the smoke rose from the burning churches. Why did it begin when it did? This is one of the great questions of history, and there is no single certain answer. But several forces seem to have come together around the end of the 8th century. The Norse population had grown, perhaps, beyond what their hard homeland could comfortably feed, creating pressure to seek wealth and land abroad. Their ships and seamanship had reached the level of perfection that made long raids possible. They had learned, through trade, of the wealth that lay to the south and west. The rich, undefended monasteries, the prosperous towns, the treasure of Christian Europe, ripe for the taking, political changes at home, the consolidation of power by ambitious chieftains and kings, may have driven the defeated and the ambitious to seek their fortunes overseas, and the lands they raided were divided and ill-defended, with no answer to an enemy from the sea. Whatever the precise mix of causes, the result was the same. The Norse came out of the north, and for 3 centuries the coasts of Europe would live in fear of the dragon ships. What began at Lindisfarne grew, over the following decades, into something far larger than mere raiding, a vast and sustained assault on the lands of Europe that swelled from summer raids into invasions, conquests, and settlements. The Viking Age proper had begun, and it would reshape the map of the Western world. At first the pattern was the hit-and-run raid. Ships coming with the summer, striking a monastery or a town, seizing plunder and slaves and captives for ransom, and sailing home again with the autumn to spend the winter on their farms. But over time the raids grew bolder and larger and more ambitious. The Vikings began to come in greater numbers, in larger fleets. They began to stay, to overwinter in the lands they raided rather than returning home, establishing fortified bases from which to plunder a whole region year-round. They struck deeper inland, rowing their shallow ships far up the great rivers of Europe, the Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, the rivers of Ireland and England, to fall upon towns and monasteries far from the sea that had thought themselves safe. They grew from raiders into armies, and from plunderers into conquerors, seeking not merely treasure but land, kingdoms, dominion. The raids fell across the whole of the Norse world's reach. The Norwegians, striking west across the opened Atlantic, fell upon Scotland and Ireland and the islands of the north and west, the Orkneys and Shetlands and Hebrides, which they seized and settled. Ireland, where they raided up every river and founded fortified bases that grew into the first true towns of Ireland, including a settlement at a place that would become Dublin. The Danes, striking south and west, fell upon England and Francia, the rich Frankish empire that Charlemagne had built. Its monasteries and towns plundered up the rivers, its great cities threatened, even Paris itself besieged. The Swedes, striking east, pushed into the Baltic and up the rivers of the eastern forests, into the lands of the Slavs, toward the riches of the east. Across thousands of miles of coastline and river, from Ireland to Russia, the dragon ships came, and Europe trembled. It was an age of terror for those who suffered the raids, and the records of the time are full of fear and lamentation. Prayers added to the litanies of the church begging God to deliver the faithful from the fury of the Northmen. Chronicles recording year after year of burning and slaughter and plunder. Whole regions depopulated, monasteries abandoned, the life of the coasts and rivers disrupted for generations. The Vikings could be terrible enemies, violent, ruthless, taking slaves, killing without mercy, descending without warning. This was a real and dreadful thing, and we should not romanticize it. The people of the raided lands had every reason for their terror, but the Viking Age was more than terror, and to see only the raiding is to miss most of the story. For even as they raided, the Norse were also trading, establishing markets and trade routes that spanned the known world, carrying goods from the Arctic to the Mediterranean to the east. They were settling, putting down roots in the lands they came to, founding towns, taking up farms, mingling with the local peoples, becoming part of the lands they had come to plunder. They were exploring, pushing out across the open ocean to islands no one had settled, to a whole new world across the Western Sea. They were craftsmen of great skill, poets of great power, lawmakers and storytellers, and shipwrights and merchants. The Viking Age was raiding, yes, but it was also one of the great ages of expansion, exploration, trade, and cultural exchange in the history of Europe. And the Norse who made it were far more than the savage raiders of the Chronicles' nightmares. To follow their story is to follow them not only to the burning monastery, but to the new-founded town, the trading market, the law assembly on the empty island, the ship striking out across the unknown ocean, and the greatest of their assaults on the settled lands of Europe, the one that came closest to conquering a kingdom, fell upon England in the form of a great army that came not to raid, but to stay. In the year 865, something new and terrible appeared on the shores of England. Not a raiding fleet come for summer plunder, but a great army, a host of Vikings come to conquer. The Norse chroniclers and the English alike called it the Great Heathen Army, and its coming marked a new and far more dangerous phase of the Viking assault, the attempt not merely to plunder England, but to conquer and rule it. England at this time was not a single kingdom, but a patchwork of several. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia in the east, and Wessex in the south, rivals and sometimes enemies, divided among themselves. Into this divided land came the great heathen army, larger by far than any raiding party, led by famous warlords, including, the sagas say, the sons of the legendary Viking Ragnar Lothbrok, come to avenge their father and win themselves kingdoms. And rather than raiding and leaving, this army came to stay. It overwintered in England, moved through the land as a conquering force, and set about the systematic subjugation of the English kingdoms one by one, and one by one, the kingdoms fell. The great army struck first at Northumbria, capturing its chief city of York and overthrowing the Northumbrian kings, taking the north. It turned on East Anglia, defeating and killing its king, Edmund, who would be remembered as a martyr and saint, killed by the heathen for his faith. It struck at Mercia, the great Midland kingdom, breaking its power and driving out its king. Within a few years of its arrival, the great heathen army had shattered 3 of the 4 English kingdoms. Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia were broken, their kings dead or fled or reduced to puppets, their lands falling under Viking control. Only one kingdom remained standing against the Norse tide, Wessex in the south, the last of the free English kingdoms, and the survival of England, the very existence of an English nation, would come to hang on the struggle between the great heathen army and the kings of Wessex, and above all on one man, a young prince who would become the only king in English history to be called the Great. The man on whom the survival of England came to depend was Alfred, King of Wessex, a younger son who had not expected to rule, a scholarly and pious man of frail health, who came to the throne in 871 as the great heathen army bore down upon his kingdom, the last of the free English realms. He would be tested almost to destruction, brought to the very edge of ruin, and would rise from it to save his kingdom and lay the foundation of a united England. And he alone among English kings would be remembered as Alfred the Great. The early years of his reign were a desperate struggle for survival. The Vikings pressed Wessex hard, and Alfred bought time with tribute and fought them in battle after battle with mixed success. And then, in the depth of winter in early 878, came the disaster that nearly ended everything. The Viking leader Guthrum launched a sudden surprise attack, falling on Wessex when no one expected a winter campaign, overrunning the kingdom, scattering Alfred's forces. Alfred himself was driven into hiding, a fugitive in his own kingdom, hunted, his cause apparently lost, sheltering with a few followers in the marshes and wild country of the Somerset levels, at a place called Athelney. It is to this lowest moment that the famous legend belongs. The story of Alfred, in disguise and despair, taking shelter in a peasant woman's hut and, lost in his troubles, letting the cakes she had left in his charge burn on the fire and being scolded by the woman who did not know she was berating her king. Whether or not the tale is true, it captures the depth of Alfred's fall. The King of Wessex reduced to a hunted fugitive in the marshes, his kingdom overrun, the last English realm on the brink of extinction. But Alfred did not give up, and from the marshes of Athelney he began to fight back. He gathered the men of the surrounding shires in secret, rallied his scattered people, and in the spring of 878 emerged from hiding to meet the Vikings in open battle. At the Battle of Edington, Alfred and the men of Wessex met Guthrum's army and won a great and decisive victory, breaking the Viking force and turning the tide of the war. The defeated Guthrum was besieged and forced to terms, and Alfred's terms were remarkable. Guthrum agreed not only to leave Wessex, but to accept Christian baptism, with Alfred himself standing as his godfather, the heathen war leader becoming a Christian, and a kind of adopted son of the king he had nearly destroyed. The peace that followed divided England between them. Alfred kept Wessex and the southwest, free and English. The Vikings kept the north and east, a great swath of England that came to be called the Danelaw, the land under Danish law, where the Norse settled in large numbers, farmed, founded towns, and left a deep and lasting imprint on the land, the language, and the people of England that endures to this day in place names, in words, in the very speech and blood of the English. England was divided, but England, free English England, survived, in Wessex under Alfred, and Alfred used the peace to build. He reorganized the defences of his kingdom, establishing a network of fortified towns, the burhs, so that no part of Wessex was far from a stronghold. He reformed the army so that it could always keep a force in the field. He even built ships to fight the Vikings at sea, and he did more than fight. This scholar king set about rebuilding the learning and culture that the Viking raids had devastated, gathering scholars to his court, promoting education, translating great books into English with his own hand, laying the foundations of English law and English letters. He had saved his kingdom, and he set about strengthening and civilizing it. His successors, his children and grandchildren, would carry on his work, gradually reconquering the Danelaw, bringing the Norse settled lands back under English rule, and uniting the English kingdoms at last into a single kingdom of England. The Vikings had nearly destroyed England, but in the struggle against them, under Alfred and his line, England was forged. The Norse, who had come to conquer, ended by becoming part of the English people, and out of the long ordeal of the Viking wars came, at last, a united English nation. While the great army fought for England, other Viking hosts fell upon the lands across the Channel, upon Francia, the great Frankish empire that Charlemagne had built, and that his quarrelling descendants now divided among themselves. And here too the Vikings came in ever greater force, rowing their ships up the great rivers of France, the Seine, the Loire, to fall upon the cities and monasteries of the Frankish heartland, and even upon Paris itself. The greatest of these assaults was the siege of Paris in 885 and 886, when an enormous Viking fleet, hundreds of ships, thousands of warriors, came up the Seine and laid siege to the city, which then occupied an island in the river and commanded the route upstream. The Parisians, under their count and their bishop, defended the city with desperate courage, holding the bridges that blocked the Vikings' passage up the river, beating back assault after assault through a long and terrible siege. The Vikings battered the walls, stormed the towers, tried every means to break into the city, and the defenders held a heroic defense that became famous in the annals of France. In the end the siege was lifted, though in a way that shamed the Frankish crown. The Frankish king, rather than fighting the Vikings, paid them to go away, and even allowed them to sail up past Paris to plunder elsewhere, a humiliating surrender that revealed the weakness of the Frankish monarchy in the face of the Norse. And out of these decades of Viking assault on Francia came one of the most consequential developments of the whole Viking age, the birth of Normandy. For the Frankish kings, unable to drive the Vikings out, eventually chose to do what Alfred had done in England, to come to terms, to settle the Norse on the land in exchange for peace and for their defense of the realm against other Vikings. In the year 911, the Frankish king made a treaty with a Viking leader named Rollo, granting him and his followers a great territory at the mouth of the Seine, in exchange for Rollo's becoming a Christian, swearing loyalty to the king, and defending the river against other raiders. This grant became the Duchy of Normandy, the land of the Northmen, the Norman land, named for the Norse who settled it, and the Normans, the descendants of Rollo's Vikings, who settled in Normandy, took up the French language and Christian faith and Frankish customs, but kept the energy and ambition and martial prowess of their Norse forebears, would become one of the most extraordinary forces in European history. Within a few generations they had transformed themselves from Viking settlers into French-speaking Christian knights, and they would go on to astonishing conquests. They would seize southern Italy and Sicily from their established rulers. They would take a leading role in the Crusades, and, most famously of all, in the year 1066, a Duke of Normandy named William, a direct descendant of the Viking Rollo, would cross the Channel, defeat the King of England at the Battle of Hastings, and conquer all of England, becoming William the Conqueror, and changing the course of English history forever. The Norman conquest of England, that great turning point, was in a sense the last and greatest Viking conquest, carried out by the Christianized, Frenchified descendants of the Northmen who had settled at the mouth of the Seine. The Vikings who raided Francia ended by founding a dynasty that would conquer England, Italy, and Sicily, and shape the medieval world. While the Norwegians struck west and the Danes struck south, the Swedes turned east, and their story, less famous than the raids on Britain and Francia, is one of the most remarkable of the whole Viking age, for the Eastern Vikings pushed deep into the forests and rivers of what would become Russia, founded the first Russian state, and reached all the way to the greatest city of the Christian world, Constantinople. The Eastern Vikings were known as the Rus, a name whose origin is debated, but which would in time give its name to Russia itself. They came across the Baltic and pushed up the rivers of the eastern forests into the lands of the Slavic peoples, using the great river systems as their roads, just as they used the sea in the west. The rivers of Eastern Europe, the Volga, the Dnieper, and others, run from the north toward the south, toward the Black Sea and the Caspian, toward the rich and ancient civilizations of the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world, and the Rus learnt to travel these river roads, carrying their ships overland between river systems where necessary, descending toward the wealthy south. They came as traders above all, for the forests of the north were rich in the things the southern markets craved: furs, honey, wax, amber, and slaves. Above all, slaves, captured among the Slavic peoples and sold in the markets of the south. The Rus built a great trade network, linking the Baltic and the northern forests to the markets of Byzantium and the Caliphate, and grew wealthy on it, and vast quantities of Arab silver flowed north into Scandinavia in exchange for the goods of the Rus. And the Rus did more than trade, they ruled. Among the Slavic peoples of the Riverlands, the Norse Rus established themselves as a ruling warrior aristocracy, founding fortified trading towns that grew into centers of power, and out of these grew the first Russian state. According to tradition, a Rus leader named Rurik established himself as ruler at Novgorod in the north, and his successors extended their power south along the rivers to the great city of Kiev, which became the center of a powerful state, Kievan Rus, the first Russian state founded and ruled by a dynasty of Norse origin that gradually merged with the Slavic population it ruled, taking up the Slavic language and, eventually, the Christian faith. From these Norse-founded beginnings would grow, across the centuries, the great nation of Russia. The Eastern Vikings, the Rus, gave their name and their first rulers to Russia itself, and the river roads led, at last, to the greatest prize of all, Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the richest and most magnificent city in the Christian world, which the Norse called Miklagard, the Great City. The Rus came down the Dnieper to the Black Sea and across to Constantinople, sometimes as raiders, launching great attacks on the city by sea, but more often as traders and, in time, as something stranger and more famous still, as the elite bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor himself. For the emperors of Byzantium came to prize the great axe-wielding Norse warriors as the most loyal and formidable of soldiers, and formed them into a special corps, the Varangian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguard, composed of Norsemen who had travelled the long river road from Scandinavia to take service in the great city. For centuries, Norse warriors served as the Varangian Guard, guarding the emperor, fighting in his wars across the Mediterranean and the Middle East, growing rich in his service, and sometimes returning home to Scandinavia laden with the wealth and the wonders of the great city, including, the sagas tell us, one warrior who would become the most famous of them all, a future king of Norway named Harald, who served in the Varangian Guard and adventured across the Byzantine world before returning north to claim a throne. From the cold forests of the north to the golden halls of Constantinople, the Eastern Vikings travelled the whole length of the known world. Not all the Norse who left their homeland came as raiders or conquerors. Some came as explorers and settlers, striking out across the open ocean not to plunder existing lands, but to find new ones, empty lands, unsettled, where they might build new lives in freedom. And the greatest of these ventures, the one that produced the most remarkable society of the whole Norse world, was the settlement of Iceland, a large island far out in the North Atlantic, a land of volcanoes and glaciers and black rock and green valleys, empty of all human habitation, that the Norse discovered, settled, and made into a free society unlike any other in their age. Iceland lies far out in the Northern Ocean, hundreds of miles west of Norway, a dramatic and forbidding land of fire and ice, active volcanoes and vast glaciers, fields of black lava and bubbling hot springs, treeless and windswept and harsh, but with green valleys and good pasture along its coasts and rivers, habitable for those tough enough to make a life there. It was discovered by Norse seafarers in the 9th century, blown off course or exploring westward, and word of the empty land spread. And then, in the decades around the 870s, a great migration began. A stream of settlers, mostly from Norway, crossing the open ocean in their nars with their families and their livestock and their possessions to claim land in the new country and build new lives there. Why did they go? Many reasons, no doubt. Land hunger, the desire for new opportunity, the spirit of adventure. But one reason looms large in the Icelandic tradition. Many of the settlers came to escape the growing power of an ambitious king, for in these same years, as we will see, a king named Harald Fairhair was conquering and uniting Norway under his sole rule, breaking the power of the independent chieftains and free farmers, and many of the proud and independent Norse, unwilling to bow to a king, chose to leave rather than submit, to cross the ocean to the empty island where they could be free, owing allegiance to no king, masters of their own land and their own lives. And so Iceland was settled, in large part, by people who valued their freedom and independence above all, who had left their homeland rather than submit to a king. And the society they built reflected that spirit, for the Icelanders built something genuinely remarkable, a free commonwealth without a king, a society of independent farmers governing themselves by law and assembly, with no monarch and no central executive power at all. The settlers spread out across the habitable land, each chieftain and farmer claiming his territory, and to govern their common affairs they created a system of assemblies, local assemblies, and above them a great national assembly, the Althing, which met once a year at a dramatic place of cliffs and lava called Thingvellir, the assembly plains. At the Althing, the free men of Iceland gathered to make and declare their laws, to settle disputes and try cases, to conduct the common business of the Commonwealth. There was a law speaker, whose duty was to memorize and recite the law. For the law was unwritten, held in memory, and spoken aloud at the assembly. But there was no king, no central government, no executive authority to enforce the law's judgments. Enforcement depended on the parties themselves and their kin and allies. It was a society held together by law and consensus, and the balance of power among its chieftains, a kind of aristocratic republic, one of the most unusual political experiments of the medieval world, the Icelandic Free State, or Commonwealth, which endured for some 3 centuries, and Iceland produced something else of incalculable value. It became, in time, the great keeper of the Norse memory. For it was in Iceland, after the conversion to Christianity brought writing, that the great body of Old Norse literature was written down. The sagas, the histories, the poems, and above all the mythology, the stories of the old gods, preserved by Icelandic scholars and writers when they had been largely lost elsewhere. Almost everything we know of Norse mythology, almost all the great stories we will hear tonight of Odin and Thor and Ragnarök, comes to us from Iceland, written down by Icelanders in the centuries after the Viking Age. The memory of the whole Norse world preserved on that remote northern island, the empty island settled by freedom-loving exiles, became the treasure house of the Norse spirit. But Iceland was not the end of the Norse road west, for from Iceland, the boldest of the explorers would push on, farther still, across even wilder seas, to lands more remote and forbidding yet. From Iceland, the Norse pushed farther west still, across an even wider and wilder stretch of the Northern Ocean, to a vast icebound land on the very edge of the habitable world, Greenland, the largest island on Earth, mostly buried under a great ice cap, but with green and habitable fjords along its southwestern coast where, for a few centuries, the Norse built the most remote European settlements on the planet. And the man who led the settlement of Greenland was one of the most colourful figures of the whole saga age, Erik the Red. Erik the Red, so called, the sagas say, for his red hair and red beard, and perhaps for his fiery temper, was a Norse settler in Iceland, who found himself, like his father before him, in trouble with the law, outlawed from Iceland for 3 years as the penalty for killings committed in a feud. An outlaw, with nowhere in Iceland to go, Erik decided to use his exile to explore, to sail west, into the unknown ocean, in search of a land that others had glimpsed but not settled. He found it. A great land far to the west, with deep fjords along its southern coast, green with pasture in the brief Arctic summer, empty of people, though the Norse would later encounter the indigenous peoples of the Arctic. Erik explored its coasts during his years of exile, and when his sentence expired he returned to Iceland to gather settlers, and here he showed himself a shrewd promoter, for he gave the new land an attractive name to draw colonists. He called it Greenland, the Greenland, reasoning, the saga says, that people would be more willing to go to a land with an inviting name. It was a piece of salesmanship that has lasted 1,000 years. The great ice island still bears the green name Erik gave it to lure settlers, and settlers came. Erik led a fleet of ships full of colonists across the ocean to Greenland in the years around 905, and established the Norse settlements there, 2 main colonies along the southwestern fjords, where the settlers built farms, raised their cattle and sheep, hunted seals and walrus and the other creatures of the Arctic, and traded the precious products of the far north, walrus ivory, furs, hides, even the occasional polar bear or live falcon, back to Europe. For some 4 or 5 centuries the Norse Greenlanders maintained their remote colonies at the very edge of the European world, the farthest flung outpost of Norse civilization. A thriving community of thousands of people living and dying on the green fjords beneath the great ice, raising churches, holding to their Norse ways, looking back across the ocean to Iceland and Norway, the most isolated Europeans on Earth. The Greenland colony would, in the end, fade away after centuries of life on the edge. The settlements declined, and finally vanished in the late medieval period, for reasons still debated, a cooling climate that shortened the growing seasons and choked the sea lanes with ice, the failure of trade with a Europe that had lost interest in their ivory, conflict or competition with the Arctic peoples, the sheer difficulty of sustaining European farming life at the edge of the Arctic as conditions worsened. The last Greenlanders died or departed, and the green fjords fell silent, and the Norse settlements became ruins under the northern sky. A poignant end to one of the great adventures of the Norse, the farthest reach of their world slowly extinguished by the cold. But before that end came, the Greenland Norse would accomplish the most astonishing feat of all the Viking Age. For, from Greenland, pushing still farther west, into seas no European had ever sailed, the Norse would reach the shores of a whole new continent and become the first Europeans to set foot in America, 500 years before Columbus. It is one of the most extraordinary facts in the history of exploration that around the year 1000, 5 centuries before Columbus, Norse seafarers from the Greenland colony crossed the last stretch of unknown ocean and reached the shores of North America, the first Europeans, so far as we know, ever to set foot in the New World. The story is told in the Icelandic sagas, long dismissed by some as mere legend, but in the 20th century, archaeologists found the proof, the unmistakable remains of a Norse settlement on the northern tip of Newfoundland, in Canada, confirming that the Norse had indeed reached America, exactly as the sagas said. The Vikings discovered America. The story, as the sagas tell it, began with a chance sighting. A Norse ship sailing to Greenland was blown off course and driven far to the west, and its crew sighted unknown lands, low, wooded coasts, unlike anything in Greenland, before working their way back. Word of these lands to the west reached Greenland, and the son of Erik the Red, a man named Leif Erikson, resolved to find and explore them. Leif the Lucky, as he came to be called, sailed west from Greenland around the year 1000 and made landfall on the coasts of North America, exploring a series of lands that the sagas name, a barren land of flat rocks and glaciers that he called Helluland, the land of flat stones, a flat, wooded land that he called Markland, the land of forests, and, farther south, a green and pleasant land of mild climate, rich with grass and timber and, most famously, wild grapes or berries, which he called Vinland, the land of wine, or the land of meadows, the fairest of the newfound lands. In Vinland, Leif and his companions built houses and spent the winter, finding the land rich and the climate mild compared to Greenland, abundant timber, which the treeless Greenland sorely needed, rich pasture, rivers full of salmon, the wild grapes that gave the land its name. They returned to Greenland laden with timber and tales of the rich new land, and in the following years other expeditions followed, Leif's brothers and other Greenlanders sailing to Vinland to explore it further and to attempt to settle it. The remains found at the northern tip of Newfoundland, turf-walled houses of unmistakable Norse construction, a place where the Norse repaired their ships and worked iron, are the physical proof of these voyages, the first known European presence in the Americas. But the Norse did not stay. They did not found a lasting colony in the New World, did not establish the European settlement of America that would wait 500 more years. The sagas tell why. In Vinland, the Norse encountered the native peoples of America, the indigenous inhabitants, whom the Norse called by an unflattering name, and with whom relations, after some initial trade, turned to hostility and violence. The Norse, a small and far-flung band at the very end of an immense supply line stretching back across 2 oceans to Greenland and Iceland and Norway, could not sustain a settlement in a land where the native peoples were numerous and increasingly hostile. After a few years of voyages and attempted settlement, the Norse gave up the effort and withdrew, abandoning Vinland, retreating to Greenland. The discovery was made, the New World reached, but it was let go, too remote and too contested to hold, and it faded into the half-legendary memory of the sagas, to be forgotten by the wider world for centuries until the archaeologists confirmed the astonishing truth. The Vikings reached America, and then sailed away, and the world would not return for 500 years. It was the farthest reach of the Norse road west. The dragon ships and the Nars that had begun by raiding the coasts of Britain had crossed, in the end, the whole width of the Atlantic, to the shores of a new world, and having followed them to the very edge of their known world, we turn now from the outer journeys to the inner one, from the lands the Vikings reached, to the gods they carried in their hearts. We turn now from the outer world of the Vikings, the raids and voyages and settlements, to their inner world, the world of their gods and their myths, one of the richest and most powerful and most distinctive mythologies the human imagination has ever produced. For the Norse carried in their hearts a great cycle of stories about their gods, their cosmos, and the fate of all things. A mythology of cold grandeur and tragic courage, of one-eyed wanderers and thunder gods and tricksters, of a world tree holding 9 worlds in its branches, and of a foretold doom in which the gods themselves will fall. To understand the Vikings is to understand this mythology, and we will spend the heart of our night's journey within it. But first, a word about how these stories come to us. For, as with the Celtic myths, the manner of their survival shapes what we have. The Norse, in the pagan age of the Vikings, did not write their mythology down. It lived in the spoken word, in the poems of the skalds and the tales told in the halls, passed down through the generations in the living memory of a people who worshipped these gods. And then the Norse were converted to Christianity, and the old gods were dethroned, and the pagan religion faded, and the myths might have been lost forever, as the myths of so many pagan peoples were lost. But they were not lost, and we owe their survival, above all, to Iceland. For it was in Christian Iceland, in the centuries after the conversion, that Icelandic scholars and writers, antiquarians who loved the old traditions of their people, set down in writing the great body of Norse myth and legend, preserving the stories of the old gods even though they themselves were Christians, valuing them as the precious heritage of their ancestors and the foundation of their poetry. The 2 great sources are both Icelandic, and both are called by the name Edda. The first is the Poetic Edda, a collection of old anonymous poems, some perhaps very ancient, preserving the myths and heroic legends in verse, the great poem of the world's creation and doom, the sayings of Odin, the tales of Thor and Loki and the rest, in the spare and powerful old poetry of the North. The second is the Prose Edda, written in the 13th century by the great Icelandic scholar, poet and chieftain Snorri Sturluson, a brilliant and systematic account of the whole mythology, written as a handbook for poets, so that they could understand the old myths that the traditional poetry constantly referenced. Snorri gathered the scattered stories, retold them clearly and vividly, and often with a wonderful wit and narrative skill, and gave us our single most important and complete account of Norse mythology. Without Snorri and the Icelandic preservers, we would know only fragments. Because of them, we have the great cycle of Norse myth in something like its full glory, though always remembering that it comes to us through Christian hands, set down centuries after the living faith had passed, shaped by the understanding and the artistry of the medieval Icelanders who saved it. So let us enter that world, the cold and magnificent cosmos of the Norse, with its 9 worlds and its world tree, its gods and giants and monsters, its creation out of fire and ice, and its foretold ending in fire and darkness. Let us begin where the Norse themselves began their understanding of all things, with the great structure of the cosmos, the world tree that holds everything together, and the 9 worlds that hang within its branches and roots. At the very center of the Norse cosmos, holding everything together, binding all the worlds into one great structure, stands a tree. Not an ordinary tree, but the world tree, the greatest and most sacred thing in all of creation. Yggdrasil, the immense ash tree whose roots and branches bind together the entire cosmos, whose trunk is the axis of all things, in whose vast structure the 9 worlds of Norse mythology hang and grow. It is one of the most powerful and beautiful images in all of world mythology. The great tree at the center of everything, ancient beyond reckoning, holding the universe in its living frame. Yggdrasil is an ash tree of unimaginable size, its trunk rising through the center of the cosmos, its branches spreading out over all the worlds and reaching up into the heavens, its roots reaching down into the depths. It is a living thing, and it suffers and endures. A great eagle sits in its topmost branches, a dragon or serpent gnaws at its roots far below, deer browse on its leaves, and a squirrel runs up and down its trunk carrying insults between the eagle above and the serpent below. The tree is tended by the Norns, the Fates, who water its roots from a sacred well to keep it alive. For the tree is constantly being damaged, gnawed and browsed and rotting, and yet endures, the suffering, enduring frame of the cosmos, ancient and ever-living, the green axis of all the worlds. And within and around Yggdrasil hang the 9 worlds, the 9 realms of Norse cosmology, the different domains of gods and giants and humans, and the dead and the other beings of the Norse universe, arranged in the great structure of the tree. At the center, in a sense, is Midgard, Middle-earth, the world of human beings, the world we inhabit, set in the middle of the cosmos, surrounded by a great ocean in which the world serpent lies coiled. Above or alongside it is Asgard, the world of the Aesir, the principal gods, Odin and Thor and the rest, the shining realm of the gods, connected to Midgard, the sagas say, by Bifrost, the rainbow bridge, the burning bridge of many colors that links the world of the gods to the world of men. There is Vanaheim, the world of the Vanir, the other family of gods. There is Jotunheim, the world of the giants, the Jetanar, the great and ancient enemies and sometime kin of the gods, dwelling in their wild realm of rock and ice and forest beyond the borders of the ordered world. There is Alfheim, the world of the elves, the light elves, beautiful and luminous beings, and Svartalfheim, or Nidavellir, the world of the dwarves, the dark elves, the master craftsmen who dwell beneath the earth and forge the great treasures of the gods. There is Niflheim, the world of ice and mist and cold, primordial and frozen, and Muspelheim, the world of fire, of flame and heat, and the fire giants, primordial and burning. And there is Hel, the world of the dead, or one of the worlds of the dead, the cold dim realm beneath the earth, ruled by the goddess Hel, where the dead who do not go to the halls of the gods go down to their long shadowy existence. 9 worlds, then. Gods and giants, elves and dwarves, humans and the dead, fire and ice, all of them held together in the vast living structure of Yggdrasil, the World-Tree, the green and suffering and enduring axis of the Norse cosmos. It is a grand and strange and beautiful conception of the universe, not a simple heaven above and earth below, but a great tree binding together 9 distinct worlds, each with its own inhabitants and character, the gods themselves only one part of a vast and populated cosmos, with the giants forever at the borders, the dead below, the fire and ice at the extremes, and the great tree holding it all. And through this cosmos move the gods whose stories we will now hear, and the first and greatest of them, the chief of the Aesir, the strange and complex and many-sided ruler of the gods, is Odin, the Allfather. At the head of the Norse gods stands Odin, the Allfather, the chief of the Aesir, the most complex, mysterious, and ambiguous of all the Norse deities, a god utterly unlike the comfortable father gods of other mythologies. He is the god of wisdom and war, of poetry and magic, of kingship and death, of frenzy and inspiration, a restless, questing, dangerous, and unfathomable figure, who will go to any length and pay any price in his ceaseless search for knowledge and his foreknowledge of the doom to come. To understand Odin is to glimpse something deep and strange in the Norse soul. Odin is, first, the god of wisdom, but his wisdom is not a peaceful, settled thing. It is a wisdom desperately sought, won at terrible cost, driven by his knowledge that the doom of the gods is coming, and his ceaseless effort to learn all he can, to delay or prepare for the end. The stories of how Odin won his wisdom are among the most striking in all mythology, for they show a god willing to sacrifice and suffer for knowledge as no other god would. To drink from the well of wisdom, the well of the wise being Mimir, at the roots of the World-Tree, Odin gave one of his eyes, plucked out his own eye, and cast it into the well as the price of a drink from its waters. And so Odin is one-eyed, the price of his wisdom written forever in his face, the god who gave an eye to see more deeply, and to win the secret of the runes, the magical letters, the source of mighty magic and hidden knowledge. Odin underwent an even more terrible ordeal. He hung himself upon the World-Tree Yggdrasil, wounded with a spear, for 9 days and 9 nights, a sacrifice of himself to himself, hanging in agony over the abyss, neither eating nor drinking, until at the edge of death the knowledge of the runes was revealed to him, and he seized it, and fell back, screaming, with the secret won. The god who hangs upon the tree, pierced and dying, to win wisdom. It is one of the most haunting images in all of Norse myth. The Allfather sacrificing himself in his desperate quest for knowledge, for Odin is haunted by what he knows, and what he knows is the doom that is coming. Ragnarök, the fall of the gods, which he foresees and cannot prevent, and against which he ceaselessly prepares. This shadow lies over everything Odin does. He gathers knowledge against the end. He gathers warriors too. For Odin is the god of the slain, the chooser of those who die in battle, and he gathers the bravest of the fallen warriors to his great hall, Valhalla, the hall of the slain, where they feast and fight and prepare to stand with the gods at the last battle. Odin sends out his agents to choose the slain, the Valkyries, the choosers of the slain, the fierce female spirits who ride over the battlefield and select which warriors will die and be brought to Valhalla. He is served by 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, Thought and Memory, who fly out over all the worlds each day and return to whisper in his ear all that they have seen, so that Odin knows all that passes. He is a wanderer, often roaming the worlds in disguise as a one-eyed old man in a wide hat and a grey cloak, leaning on his staff, testing and questioning and gathering knowledge, appearing among gods and men and giants in his ceaseless, restless quest. And Odin is dangerous even to his own. a god of war and frenzy who gives victory and withdraws it, who inspires the battle madness of the berserker and the inspired fury of the poet, for the same word lies behind both, who is associated with the darker magic and the breaking of oaths and the betrayal of his own favourites when his deeper purposes require it. He is not a safe god, not a kindly father. He is the patron of kings and warriors and poets, the giver of victory and wisdom and inspiration, but always for his own vast and shadowed purposes, always with the doom to come in view. He is the Allfather, wise, terrible, self-sacrificing, treacherous, inspired and doomed, and he stands at the head of the Norse gods as one of the most extraordinary divine figures the human imagination has ever conceived, and beside him, utterly different in nature. Straightforward where Odin is subtle, honest where Odin is cunning, the beloved protector where Odin is the dangerous king, stands the most popular of all the Norse gods, his son, the thunder god, Thor. If Odin was the god of kings and poets and the dangerous seeker of wisdom, Thor was the god of the common people, the most beloved, the most popular, the most widely worshipped of all the Norse gods, the mighty thunder god, whose name still echoes in our word for the 5th day of the week, Thursday, Thor's Day, where Odin is subtle and ambiguous and dangerous. Thor is straightforward, honest, immensely strong, quick to anger but good at heart, the great protector of gods and men against the forces of chaos, the defender of Midgard and Asgard against the giants, the divine champion whose strength and courage hold the monsters at bay. He was the god ordinary Norsemen loved and trusted, and his hammer was their protection. Thor is the god of thunder and storm. The thunder is the rolling of his chariot across the sky, drawn by 2 great goats. The lightning is the flash of his weapon, and his weapon is the most famous object in all of Norse mythology. Mjolnir, the great hammer, forged by the dwarves, a weapon of terrible power that never misses its mark and always returns to Thor's hand when thrown, with which he smashes the skulls of giants and defends the worlds of gods and men. Mjolnir is not only a weapon but a sacred thing, a symbol of protection and blessing, used to hallow and bless as well as to destroy, the holy hammer that wards off evil, and the Norse wore small hammer amulets, images of Mjolnir, as protective charms and signs of their faith, just as Christians wore the cross. With Mjolnir, and with his belt of strength that doubles his mighty power, and his iron gauntlets, Thor is the great defender, the strongest of the gods, the bulwark against the giants who threaten the ordered world. The stories of Thor are among the most entertaining in all of Norse myth, for they show the great thunder god in all his strength and appetite, and occasional comic bafflement, striding through the worlds, smashing giants, eating and drinking enormously, sometimes outwitted but never outfought, the mighty and somewhat simple champion. Many of his tales tell of his expeditions against the giants, the Jutna, the ancient enemies of the gods, Thor venturing into Jotunheim, the land of the giants, to battle the monsters and protect the worlds. He is the god's shield and sword against the forces of chaos and destruction, the one who stands between the ordered cosmos and the giants who would tear it down. And in the great battle at the end of the world, Ragnarök, it is Thor who will face the greatest monster of all, the world serpent, Jörmungand, the vast serpent that encircles the world, in a duel to the death that has been fated since the beginning. For Thor and the world serpent are ancient enemies, bound together by fate. The serpent, Jörmungand, is one of the monstrous children of Loki, cast into the great ocean that surrounds Midgard, where it grew so vast that it encircles the entire world, biting its own tail. And Thor and the serpent have met before, in one of the most famous of all the Thor stories, the tale of Thor's fishing expedition, when the thunder god, fishing from a boat with a giant, baited an enormous hook with an ox head and cast it into the deep and hooked the world serpent itself, and hauled the monstrous serpent up from the depths, the 2 ancient enemies glaring at each other across the gunwale of the boat, Thor raising his hammer to strike the killing blow, only for the terrified giant to cut the line, and the serpent to sink back into the deep, the battle postponed. That it is only postponed, for at Ragnarök, Thor and the serpent will meet again, for the last time, and that battle will not be interrupted. Thor will slay the world serpent at last, but the serpent's venom will be his own death, and the great protector of the gods will fall. But that is the end of the story, and we have other gods to meet before we reach it, including the strangest and most troubling of them all, the one who is both among the gods and against them, the trickster whose cunning serves and dooms the gods in equal measure, Loki. Among all the figures of Norse mythology, none is stranger more troubling, or more fascinating than Loki. The trickster, the shapeshifter, the cunning and treacherous figure who dwells among the gods but is not truly one of them, who helps them and harms them by turns, whose cleverness gets them into trouble and out of it again, and who will, at the last, turn fully against them and lead the forces of chaos at the destruction of the world. Loki is the great ambiguous figure of Norse myth, the principle of mischief and change and disorder, neither simply good nor simply evil, but something more unsettling, the necessary troublemaker, the chaos within the order, the friend who becomes the ultimate enemy. Loki is, by origin, a giant, one of the Jetnar, the ancient race of the gods' enemies, yet he dwells among the Aesir, the gods, as a kind of companion and blood brother to Odin himself, a member of the divine community though not of its blood. He is clever beyond all the other gods, quick-witted and cunning and silver-tongued, a master of tricks and schemes and shape-shifting, able to change his form into anything, bird, fish, animal even, in one famous tale, into a mare. And his cleverness is a double-edged thing. Again and again in the myths, it is Loki's mischief that creates a crisis, and Loki's cunning that resolves it. He causes a problem through his trickery, and then, forced by the angry gods to fix it, devises some clever scheme that not only solves the crisis but often wins the gods some great treasure in the process. It is Loki, through one such episode of mischief and repair, who is responsible for the gods acquiring their greatest treasures, including Thor's hammer Mjolnir, which the dwarves forged in a contest that Loki had engineered. He is the source of much that the gods possess, and much that they suffer, the engine of change and trouble and unintended consequence. But there is a darker side to Loki, growing through the myths, that turns at last to outright malice and brings about catastrophe. For Loki is also the father of monsters, the parent, by a giantess, of three terrible beings who are fated to play their part in the doom of the gods: the great wolf Fenrir, who will devour Odin at Ragnarök, the world serpent Jörmungand, who will battle Thor, and Hel, the goddess of the dead, who rules the realm of the dead beneath the earth. These monstrous children, Loki's offspring, are the very forces that will destroy the gods at the end, so that Loki is, in a sense, the father of the doom, the parent of the monsters who will bring down the world. And Loki's mischief darkens, over the course of the mythology, from troublesome pranks into genuine malice, and at last into the unforgivable crime that turns the gods against him forever and sets the stage for the end of all things, the death of Baldr, the bright and beloved god, which Loki contrives, the murder, through Loki's cunning, of the most loved of all the gods, an act of pure malice that breaks the fellowship of the gods and brings grief and doom into Asgard. For this crime the gods will at last bind Loki in terrible torment beneath the earth, and there he will lie until the end, until Ragnarök, when he breaks free and leads the forces of chaos, the giants and the monsters and the dead, against the gods in the final battle. Loki, the trickster who dwelt among the gods, becomes at the last their ultimate enemy, the leader of their destruction. He is the chaos that the order could not do without and could not finally contain, the friend who was always, in the end, the enemy, the cleverness that served the gods and then destroyed them, the strange, brilliant, treacherous heart of the Norse myth. But before we follow the thread of doom to its end, we should meet the other gods of the Norse world and hear how the whole cosmos came to be. Beyond the great figures of Odin, Thor, and Loki, the Norse cosmos was populated by many other gods and goddesses, powers of fertility and love and the sea and the harvest and the dead, who filled out the divine world and received the worship and the prayers of the Norse. And there is a deep division in the Norse pantheon, a hint of an ancient history that we should understand. The gods are divided into two families, the Aesir and the Vanir, who were once at war and then made peace. The Aesir are the principal gods, the gods of Asgard, Odin, Thor, and most of the major deities, the gods of war and sky, and power and order. The Vanir are a second family of gods, associated above all with fertility, prosperity, the harvest, the sea, and wealth, older, perhaps in some sense, gods of the earth and its abundance. The myths tell that the Aesir and the Vanir once fought a great war, the first war in the world, that ended not in victory for either side, but in a truce and an exchange of hostages, the two families of gods making peace and mingling, with certain of the Vanir coming to live among the Aesir in Asgard. This myth of the war and reconciliation of two divine families may preserve some dim memory of a real history, the meeting of two religious traditions, two sets of gods, merged into one pantheon, But in the mythology, it simply explains why there are two kinds of gods, now united, the powers of war and order, joined with the powers of fertility and wealth. The greatest of the Vanir who came to dwell among the Aesir were Njord and his children, Freyr and Freyja. Njord is the god of the sea and seafaring, of the wind and the wealth that comes from the sea, a god much valued by a seafaring people. His son Freyr is one of the most important of all the Norse gods, the god of fertility, prosperity, sunshine, good harvests and peace, a beautiful and beneficent god who brings the fruitfulness of the earth and the prosperity of the people, lord of the elves, possessor of a magical ship and a golden boar, a god of life and abundance and gentle power, widely beloved across the Norse world. And his sister Freyja is the great goddess of the Norse pantheon, the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and also, strikingly, of war and death. For Freyja too has her claim on the slain, receiving half of those who die in battle in her own hall, while Odin takes the other half to Valhalla. Freyja is a powerful and many-sided goddess, of love and desire and beauty, but also of magic and war and death, riding in a chariot drawn by cats, weeping tears of gold, mistress of a powerful form of magic called Sidor, one of the most important and complex of the Norse deities. And there were many other gods and powers. There was Frigg, Odin's wife, the queen of the Aesir, a goddess of marriage and motherhood and foreknowledge, who knows the fates but does not speak them. There was Baldr, the bright and beautiful and beloved god, the most gentle and radiant of the Aesir, whose death would be the great tragedy of the gods. There was Tyr, the brave god of war and justice, who sacrificed his hand to bind the great wolf Fenrir. There was Heimdall, the watchman of the gods, who guards the rainbow bridge Bifrost, and will sound the horn that summons the gods to the last battle, whose senses are so keen he can hear the grass growing. There was Idun, keeper of the golden apples that give the gods their eternal youth. And there were the darker powers, and the dead, Hel, the goddess of the underworld, the Norns, the Fates, the giants and monsters at the borders of the world. Together they made up the rich and populous divine world of the Norse, a cosmos full of gods and powers, of order and chaos, of life and death, all of it bound for the doom that the gods foresaw and could not escape. But before the doom, there was the beginning, and we should hear how, in the Norse telling, the whole of it came to be. The creation of the world out of fire and ice. How did the world begin? The Norse had an answer. A creation myth, as cold and strange and powerful as everything else in their mythology. A story of the world arising not from a word or a divine craftsman, but from the meeting of fire and ice across a great primordial void, and from the body of a slain giant. It is one of the most distinctive creation myths in all of world mythology, and it begins with emptiness. In the beginning, the Norse said, there was Ginnunga gap, the great yawning void, the primordial emptiness, the gap that existed before the worlds. And at the two extremes of this void lay two primordial realms. To the north, Niflheim, the world of ice and mist and freezing cold, of frost and rime and frozen rivers, and to the south, Muspelheim, the world of fire and heat and flame, blazing and burning. For ages these two realms existed at the opposite ends of the void, the absolute cold and the absolute heat, the ice and the fire, and between them lay the great emptiness of Ginnungagap. And then, in the middle of the void, the fire and the ice met. The heat of Muspelheim reached out toward the ice of Niflheim, and where the warm air met the frost, the ice began to melt and drip, and from the melting ice, from the meeting of fire and ice in the void, life arose. From the melting rime came the first being, Ymir, the primordial giant, the ancestor of all the giants, vast and primordial, born from the dripping ice. And from the same melting ice came a great primordial cow, Audumla, who nourished Ymir with her milk, and who herself fed by licking the salty ice. And as she licked the ice, she uncovered, over 3 days, another being frozen within it, the ancestor of the gods, from whom the line of the Aesir would descend. So from the primordial ice came both the first giant and the ancestor of the gods, the two great races born from the same frozen origin, kin and enemies from the very beginning. And then came the act of creation proper, which in the Norse telling is also an act of violence, the slaying of Ymir. The early gods, Odin and his brothers, descended from the being freed from the ice, rose up against the primordial giant Ymir and killed him, and from his vast body they made the world. This is the strange and powerful heart of the Norse creation. The world is made from the body of a murdered giant. From Ymir's flesh the gods made the earth. From his blood the seas and lakes and rivers, from his bones the mountains, from his teeth and shattered bones the rocks and stones, from his skull the dome of the sky, held up at its four corners, from his brains the clouds, from his hair the trees. The whole physical world, in the Norse imagining, is the body of the slain primordial giant, reshaped by the gods into the earth and sea and sky and mountains. A cosmos built, quite literally, from the corpse of a primordial being, born of the meeting of fire and ice. The gods then ordered the world, set the sun and moon in their courses, established the realms, and created the first man and woman from two pieces of driftwood found on the shore, giving them life and breath and spirit. And so the world was made, out of fire and ice and the void, out of the body of a slain giant, by gods who were themselves kin to the giants they killed and would fight forever after. It is a creation as harsh and grand and strange as the Norse world itself, and it carries within it, from the very beginning, the seed of the conflict that would end it, the ancient enmity of gods and giants, born together from the ice, that would culminate at last in the doom of all things. Before we follow the dark thread toward the doom of the gods, let us linger among the lighter and more wondrous tales, the great adventures of Thor, which are among the most beloved and entertaining stories in all of Norse myth, full of the thunder god's strength and appetite, and the strange wonders of the giant world. For Thor was forever venturing into Jotunheim, the land of the giants, to test his strength against the monsters and the magic of the gods' ancient enemies, and his journeys there produced tales of marvelous strangeness and humor and power. The most famous of these is the tale of Thor's journey to the hall of the giant Utgard Loki, a story of a god humbled by giant magic that is also a meditation on the limits of even divine strength. Thor, traveling to the land of the giants with Loki and two human servants, came to the vast hall of a giant king, Utgard Loki, and there he and his companions were challenged to contests to prove their worth, and, to Thor's fury and humiliation, they failed at every one. Loki lost an eating contest, unable to consume food as fast as his opponent. Thor's young servant lost a foot race, and Thor himself, the mighty thunder god, was humiliated 3 times over. Challenged to drain a drinking horn in 3 draughts, he drank with all his godlike might and could barely lower the level at all. Challenged to lift a mere cat from the floor, he strained with all his strength and could raise only a single paw. Challenged to wrestle an old woman, he was brought to one knee by the aged crone. The mighty Thor, shamed and baffled, left the hall in a fury at his own failure. But then Utgard Loki revealed the truth, and the humiliation became a wonder. It had all been illusion and giant magic, and Thor had in fact performed feats so mighty they had terrified the giants. The drinking horn had been connected to the sea itself, and Thor's 3 great draughts had lowered the level of all the oceans, creating the tides. The cat had been the world serpent itself, that encircles the earth, and Thor had lifted it until only one of its coils touched the ground, nearly hauling the world-girdling serpent from the sea. And the old woman had been old age itself, against whom none can finally stand, and yet Thor had resisted her and gone down only to one knee, a feat no other being could match. Thor's apparent failures had been in truth displays of strength so vast they had frightened the giants into using all their magic against him. Enraged at the deception, Thor raised his hammer to smash Utgard Loki and his hall, but the giant and the hall vanished, for one cannot easily take vengeance on illusion. It is a wonderful tale, at once comic and profound, showing Thor's tremendous power and his vulnerability to trickery, and touching on deep things, the tides, the world serpent, the inevitability of age, beneath its humour. Another famous tale tells of the theft of Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, by the giants. For the giants, knowing that the hammer was the god's chief defence, stole it away, and the giant who had taken it demanded, as the price of its return, the hand of the beautiful goddess Freya in marriage. The gods were in despair, for without the hammer Asgard lay open to the giants, but Freya refused utterly to be given to a giant. And so Loki devised a characteristically cunning and outrageous scheme. Thor himself would go to the giants disguised as Freya, dressed as the bride, veiled, to recover the hammer. The mighty thunder god, much against his will and his dignity, was dressed in a bridal gown and veil and bridal jewels, with Loki as his handmaid, and the two went to the giants' hall, where Thor, barely concealing his identity through a series of comic near-disasters, devouring a whole ox and 8 salmon at the wedding feast, his eyes blazing through the veil, explained away each time by the quick-thinking Loki, waited for his moment, and the moment came when, as part of the wedding ritual, The hammer Mjolnir was brought out and laid in the bride's lap to hallow the marriage. The instant Thor's hands closed on his hammer, the disguise was over. He rose up in his wrath and slew the giants and recovered his weapon, the god's defense restored. It is one of the most purely entertaining of all the Norse tales, the great thunder god in a wedding dress. A story of comedy and triumph at the expense of the giants. These tales of Thor, the humbling in Utgard, the hammer recovered in disguise, and many more, show the brighter, more wondrous, more humorous side of Norse myth, the delight in strength and cunning, and the strange marvels of the giant world. But beneath all the wonder and the humour, the shadow of the doom was always present. And we turn now to the story where the shadow falls at last, the turning point of the whole mythology, the event that begins the slide toward Ragnarök, the death of the bright god Baldr. Of all the gods, the most beloved was Baldr, Baldr the bright, the beautiful, the gentle, the radiant son of Odin and Frigg, the god so fair and good and luminous that he was the joy of all the gods, beloved by all things, the very light and gladness of Asgard. And the death of Baldr is the great tragedy of Norse mythology, the turning point of the whole cycle, the moment when grief and death enter Asgard, and the long slide toward the doom of the gods begins. It is a story of foreboding, of a mother's love, of a trickster's malice, and of a loss that can never be undone. It began with dreams, for Baldr began to be troubled by ominous dreams, dreams that foretold his death, and the gods, alarmed, sought to protect their beloved. Baldr's mother, Frigg, who knew the fates, took action to save her son. She travelled throughout all the worlds and exacted an oath from everything in creation, from fire and water, from iron and every metal, from stones, from the earth, from trees, from beasts and birds and serpents, from sicknesses and poisons, from everything that might harm him. An oath that none of them would ever hurt Baldr. And so Baldr became invulnerable, for nothing in all the worlds would harm him, all things having sworn to spare him. And the gods, delighted and reassured, made a game of his invulnerability. They would stand Baldr up in their assembly and throw things at him, strike at him with weapons, hurl stones at him, and everything refused to harm him, glancing away, leaving him unhurt, and the gods laughed at the wonderful sight of the bright god standing unharmed amid the spears and stones, beloved and protected by all creation. But Loki, whose malice had grown dark, could not bear this gladness, and set about to destroy it. Disguising himself, he came to Frigg and craftily drew from her the one secret flaw in her great protection. There was a single thing in all the worlds from which she had not taken the oath, a small and harmless-seeming plant, the mistletoe, which grew west of Valhalla, and which she had thought too young and too weak to bother with, too harmless to require an oath. And Loki, learning this, went and cut the mistletoe and fashioned from it a dart or shaft, the one thing in all creation that could harm Baldr, the small overlooked plant made into a weapon. He returned to the assembly where the gods were still at their game, throwing things at the invulnerable Baldr, and there stood Baldr's brother, the blind god Hoder, off to the side, unable to join the game because he could not see to aim. Loki approached him with false kindness. "Let me help you honor your brother," he said. "Here is something to throw, and I will guide your aim." And he put the mistletoe dart into the blind god's hand, and directed his throw, and Hoder, all unknowing, cast the mistletoe at his brother, and it struck Baldr, and pierced him, and the bright god fell down dead. A terrible silence fell upon the gods, and then a grief beyond anything they had known, for the most beloved of all of them lay dead, slain in their midst by a brother's hand guided by Loki's malice, and the light and gladness of Asgard was extinguished. It was the first death among the gods, the entry of mortality and grief and doom into the divine world. And the gods understood, in their sorrow, that something irrevocable had happened, that the shadow had fallen at last. They tried desperately to undo it. A messenger was sent riding down the long dark road to Hel, the realm of the dead, to beg the goddess of death to release Baldr, and Hel agreed, but on one condition, that every single thing in all the worlds must weep for Baldr, must shed tears for the bright god. And if all things wept, he would be released and return. And so the gods sent word throughout all creation, and all things wept for Baldr, all the worlds, all beings, all things living and dead, men and beasts and stones and trees and metals, all weeping for the beloved god, all save one. For in a cave sat an old giantess, Loki, in disguise, the malice complete, who refused to weep, who said let Hel keep what she has, and would shed no tear for Baldr. And because of that one refusal, that single dry-eyed giantess who was Loki in his final malice. Baldr could not be released, and remained in the realm of the dead, lost to the gods until the end of the world. The bright god was gone. Grief had come to stay in Asgard, and the gods now knew their enemy, Loki, whose malice had murdered the best of them. The long peace was over. The slide toward the doom had begun. After the death of Baldr, the gods' long tolerance of Loki was at an end, for now they knew him for what he had become, the murderer of the bright god, the malice at the heart of their fellowship, and their grief turned to wrath, and they resolved to punish him at last. The binding of Loki is one of the darkest and most terrible of the Norse myths, a tale of vengeance and torment that sets the final stage for the doom to come, and that holds the chaos in chains until the appointed hour of its breaking. Loki, knowing the gods' wrath was upon him, fled and hid, transforming himself, building a house with doors on every side so he could watch for his pursuers, and by day changing himself into a salmon and hiding in a waterfall. But the gods, with Odin's all-seeing wisdom, found him out and came to catch him. Loki, as a salmon, tried to escape them by leaping, but the gods wove a net to catch him, and after a great struggle, Thor seized the leaping salmon in his mighty hand, gripping it by the tail, and Loki was caught and forced back into his own shape, captured at last, and the gods' vengeance was terrible. They took Loki to a cave, and there they bound him, and the manner of his binding was cruel beyond ordinary cruelty. They took Loki's own sons, and transformed one of them into a wolf, which tore apart the other, and from the entrails of the slain son they made the bonds that held Loki, and these bonds turned to iron, binding him fast to 3 great stones within the cave, immovable. And then, to compound his torment, a great venomous serpent was fastened above him, so positioned that its venom dripped down, drop by drop, onto Loki's upturned face, a slow torture of burning poison falling endlessly upon him. But Loki was not entirely without mercy, for his faithful wife Sigyn remained with him in his torment, and she held a bowl above his face to catch the dripping venom and spare him its burning. Yet even this mercy was incomplete, for when the bowl filled, Sigyn had to turn away to empty it, and in those moments the venom fell upon Loki's face once more, and he writhed in such agony that the whole earth shook with his convulsions, and this, the Norse said, is the cause of earthquakes, the writhing of the bound Loki when the poison strikes his face. And so Loki lay, bound in torment in his cave beneath the earth, his faithful wife holding the bowl above him, the venom dripping, the earth shaking with his agony. And there he would lie, the chaos chained, the malice imprisoned, until the appointed end. For the binding of Loki is not the end of his story. It is only the holding of him until the doom. At Ragnarök, the great wolf and the bonds will break, and Loki will burst free at last from his cave of torment, and he will lead the forces of chaos, the giants and the monsters and the dead, against the gods in the final battle. His binding is the chaining of the doom, the holding back of the end. But the end is fated, and the chains will not hold forever. And now, with Baldr dead and Loki bound, with grief in Asgard and the enemy chained but waiting, all the pieces are in place, all the threads drawn taut, and we come at last to the greatest and darkest and most magnificent of all the Norse myths, the story toward which the whole mythology has been moving, the doom of the gods, the end of the world, Ragnarök. Now we come to the heart of the Norse vision, the greatest and darkest of all their myths, the story that gives the whole mythology its tragic grandeur and sets it apart from all others. Ragnarök, the doom of the gods, the twilight of the gods, the foretold end of the world in which the gods themselves go down to destruction in a final battle against the forces of chaos and fire, a battle they know they cannot win, and fight anyway. There is nothing else quite like it in world mythology, a religion whose central, defining story is the foretold defeat and death of its own gods. To understand Ragnarök is to understand the deepest thing in the Norse soul. The gods know it is coming. This is the crucial fact that shadows the whole mythology. Ragnarök is foretold, prophesied, known in advance. Odin has sought out the knowledge of it, has questioned the dead and the wise, and knows the doom that awaits him and all the gods. They know they are fated to fall. They know the day is coming when the chaos will break loose, and the world will end, and they themselves will die. And they live in the knowledge of it, preparing for a battle they cannot win, gathering their forces, doing what they can, facing their doom with open eyes. This is the Norse heroism in its purest form, raised to the cosmic scale, to face a fate you cannot escape, to fight on against certain defeat, to meet your doom with courage and without flinching, the gods themselves embodying the ideal that the Norse warrior aspired to, the brave acceptance of an unavoidable end. The signs of Ragnarok's coming are terrible. First will come a great and terrible winter, Fimbulwinter, the mighty winter, 3 winters together with no summer between them, a time of bitter cold and snow and darkness across all the world, when the sun gives no warmth and the world freezes. Morality will collapse among men. Brothers will kill brothers. The bonds of kinship will break. It will be an age of wolves and axes and the breaking of all order. The wolves that chase the sun and the moon across the sky will at last catch and devour them, and the sun and moon will be swallowed, and the stars will vanish, and the world will go dark. The earth will shake. Loki and the great wolf Fenrir will break free of their bonds at last. The world serpent will rise from the sea, churning the oceans, flooding the land, and from every direction the enemies of the gods will gather and march on Asgard. The giants, the monsters, the fire giants from Muspelheim led by the fire demon Surt with his flaming sword, Loki at the head of the forces of chaos, the dead rising from hell, the whole array of the powers of destruction converging for the final battle. Heimdall, the watchman of the gods, will sound his great horn, the Gjallarhorn, its blast ringing through all the worlds, summoning the gods and the chosen warriors of Valhalla to the last battle. And the gods will arm and ride out to meet their doom, Odin leading the heroes of Valhalla, all the gods going forth to the final field, to Vigrid, the great plain where the last battle will be fought. And there, on that plain, the gods and their enemies will meet in the battle at the end of the world, and the great duels fated since the beginning will be fought to their conclusion. Odin will face the great wolf Fenrir, and the wolf will prevail and swallow the Allfather, the chief of the gods devoured by the monster, though Odin's son will avenge him, tearing the wolf apart. Thor will face his ancient enemy, the world serpent, in their final meeting, and Thor will slay the serpent at last, smashing it with his hammer. But the serpent's venom will be his death, and the mighty thunder god will stagger back 9 steps and fall down dead, poisoned, the great protector of the worlds fallen at the last. Tyr will fall, and Heimdall and Loki will slay each other, the watchman and the traitor dying together. One by one the gods and the monsters will destroy each other, the whole divine order and the whole force of chaos consuming one another in mutual destruction. And then the fire. Surt, the fire giant, will fling his flaming sword across the whole world, and the fire will consume everything. The earth, the trees, the mountains, all the 9 worlds, all of creation going up in flame. And the burned and broken earth will sink at last beneath the sea, the world drowning in the dark water, everything ending, the gods dead, the monsters dead, the world burned and sunk beneath the waves, the cosmos returned to the darkness and the water from which it came. The doom is complete. The gods have fallen. The world has ended. It is the bleakest vision in all of mythology. The total destruction of the gods and the world, foreseen and unavoidable and fulfilled. And yet, and this is the final, redeeming note of the great myth, it is not quite the absolute end, for out of the destruction the Norse said, a new world will rise. The earth will surface again from the sea, green and new and fresh, washed clean, more beautiful than before. A few of the gods will survive the doom, the sons of the fallen gods, a new generation, and Baldr himself, the bright god, will return from the dead, released at last by the ending of the old world, coming back into the new green earth, and 2 human beings, a man and a woman, will have survived the fire by sheltering within the World-Tree. And from them a new humanity will descend to people the new world. The sun, before she was devoured, will have borne a daughter as bright as herself, who will light the new sky. And so, after the doom, after the death of the gods and the burning of the world, life will begin again, green and new, in a world made fresh, the cycle of destruction and renewal, the death of the old world and the birth of the new. The doom is real and total, but beyond it, faintly, is the promise of renewal. The green earth rising again from the sea, Baldr returning, life beginning anew. It is a vision of magnificent and tragic grandeur. The gods who face their doom with courage, the world that ends in fire and water, and the new world that rises, green and washed and hopeful, from the ruin of the old. The shadow of Ragnarök explains one of the most famous features of the Norse afterlife, for the knowledge of the coming battle shaped the Norse vision of what awaited the warrior after death, and gave us the great image of Valhalla, the hall of the slain, where the chosen warriors gather to prepare for the doom. The Norse afterlife was not a simple heaven and hell, but a complex of destinations, and the most glorious of them was bound up with the god's need for warriors at the end of the world. Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, is Odin's great hall in Asgard, vast and magnificent, roofed with golden shields, its rafters made of spears, with hundreds of doors, where Odin gathers the souls of the bravest warriors who die in battle. For Odin, knowing Ragnarök is coming, needs an army for the final battle, and he gathers it from among the fallen heroes of the world. The Valkyries, the choosers of the slain, ride over the battlefields and select the worthy dead, the bravest who fall in combat, and bring them to Valhalla to join the host that will fight at the end. To die bravely in battle and be chosen for Valhalla was the finest fate a Norse warrior could hope for. To be taken up by the Valkyries to Odin's hall, there to join the company of heroes, and the life of Valhalla is the warrior's paradise, perfectly suited to the Norse ideal. Each day the chosen warriors, the Einherbi, the lone fighters, go out to fight, battling each other in glorious combat, training for the great battle to come, killing and being killed. And each evening, all their wounds healed and all the slain restored to life, they return to the hall to feast through the night, eating the meat of a magical boar that is slaughtered each day and made whole again each night, drinking the mead that flows endlessly, served by the Valkyries, feasting and drinking and boasting in the great golden hall, fighting all day and feasting all night, forever. For the Norse warrior, this was paradise. Eternal battle and eternal feast, the two greatest joys of the warrior's life, in the company of heroes, in the hall of the god, preparing for the glory of the final battle. It is a vision of the afterlife that perfectly captures the warrior values of the Norse, that the highest reward was not peace and rest, but eternal combat and feasting, glory and good company, in preparation for a doomed but glorious last stand. But Valhalla was not the only destination of the Norse dead, and not all went there. Freya, the goddess, received half of those who fell in battle in her own hall, a counterpart to Odin's Valhalla. Those who died at sea, some said, went to the hall of the sea goddess, and the great majority, those who did not die gloriously in battle, who died of sickness or age or in their beds, went down to Hel, the realm of the dead beneath the earth, ruled by the goddess Hel, Loki's daughter, not a place of fiery torment like the Christian hell that shares its name, but a cold, dim, shadowy realm, the gloomy underworld where the ordinary dead went on in a kind of grey half-existence, neither punished nor rewarded, simply dead. The Norse afterlife, then, reflected the Norse values. Glory in battle led to the golden halls of the gods and the company of heroes. Ordinary death led down to the cold grey realm of hell. To die well, bravely, in battle, was to win not only honour among the living, but a place among the chosen dead. And this belief, this hope of Valhalla, gave the Norse warrior his famous courage in the face of death, his willingness to die fighting, his eagerness even for the glorious end. For the brave death was the door to the hall of the slain, and the cold grey realm of hell awaited those who clung too long to life. Underlying all of Norse mythology, the gods, the doom, the heroism, is a particular and powerful vision of fate, of destiny, of the way the lives of gods and men are woven and bound, that shaped the whole Norse understanding of existence and gave their courage its peculiar quality. To understand the Norse, you must understand how they thought about fate. For fate, to them, was the deepest power in the cosmos, stronger even than the gods. At the roots of the World-Tree, beside the sacred well, dwell the Norns, the three great fates of Norse mythology, mysterious female beings who shape the destinies of all things, gods and men alike. They are often named as three, one of the past, one of the present, one of the future, all bearing names that suggest what is becoming, and what shall be. And they weave or carve or ordain the fates of all beings, determining the course of every life, the length of every span, the doom of every god and man. They water the World-Tree to keep it alive, and they shape the fate of the cosmos. And their decrees are final. What the Norns ordain comes to pass. Fate, once woven, cannot be unwoven. Destiny cannot be escaped, not by men, not even by the gods. Even Odin, even the Allfather, cannot escape the doom the fates have ordained. Ragnarök will come, and he will die, and all his wisdom cannot prevent it. Fate is the deepest law of the Norse cosmos, binding all things, inescapable. This vision of inescapable fate, that every being's destiny is woven and fixed, that the day and manner of one's death is already determined, that nothing can change what is fated to be, might seem to lead to despair or passivity, but in the Norse soul, Remarkably, it led to the opposite, to courage. For if your fate is fixed, if the day of your death is already woven and cannot be changed, then there is no point in cowardice, no use in clinging to life, no safety to be bought by holding back. You will die on the day you are fated to die, no sooner and no later, whatever you do. And so the only thing that matters, the only thing within your power, is how you meet your fate, whether you face it with courage or with fear, whether you die well or badly, whether you win honor and glory in the time you have or waste it in fear. The fixedness of fate, far from breeding passivity, freed the Norse warrior for reckless courage. Since you cannot change when you will die, you may as well die bravely, win glory, face your doom without flinching, for the manner of your death and the reputation you leave are the only things truly in your hands. This is the deep root of the famous Norse courage, and it is the same courage the gods themselves display at Ragnarök, the brave acceptance of an unavoidable doom, the resolve to meet a fixed and fatal destiny with honor and defiance rather than fear. The gods know they will fall, and they arm and ride out to the battle anyway, fighting their doom with magnificent courage precisely because they cannot escape it. The warrior knows he will die on his fated day, and so he seeks glory and faces death without flinching. Fate is fixed, courage is the response, and the meeting of inescapable doom with unflinching courage is the noblest thing in the Norse vision of life. It is a hard and grand and tragic philosophy, born of a hard land and a hard life, and it gives the whole of Norse mythology and the whole of the Viking spirit its distinctive character, the courage that does not depend on hope, the defiance that does not depend on victory, the resolve to meet whatever comes with honor, in a world where even the gods are doomed, and even the gods face their doom bravely. Having seen the inner world of the Norse, their gods, their cosmos, their doom, their fate, their courage, let us return now to the outer world, to the society and the daily life and the great deeds of the Viking Age, carrying with us the understanding of the spirit that animated it all. Having journeyed through the gods and the doom, let us return to the human world of the Vikings, to their society, their daily life, the ordinary fabric of existence in the Norse world, which was as distinctive and as worthy of understanding as their raids and their myths. For beneath the famous warriors and explorers was a whole society, structured and lawful and complex. And to know the Vikings is to know how they lived, how they ordered themselves, how they governed and worked and dwelt in their cold northern world. Norse society was divided, broadly, into three classes, and the old poetry described their origins in myth, that the god Heimdall, wandering the world, fathered the three classes of humankind. At the bottom were the thralls, the slaves, the unfree, who did the hardest labor and had few rights, who could be bought and sold, who were often captives taken in raids or war, or the descendants of such captives. Slavery was a real and important part of the Norse world. The Vikings were major slave traders, capturing people in their raids across Europe and selling them in the markets of the Norse world and beyond, and slaves did much of the heavy labor on the farms and in the households of the free. It is one of the harsher truths of the Viking Age, easily forgotten amid the romance of dragon ships and gods, that this was a slave-owning, slave-trading society, and that much of its labor and much of its wealth rested on the unfree. In the middle, and at the heart of Norse society, were the free men, the carls, the bondi, the independent farmers who owned their own land, bore their own arms, and took their place as full members of the community. This was the great central class of the Norse world, the backbone of its society. Free farmers, proud and independent, who worked their land, attended the assembly, bore weapons, and answered to no master. The free farmer was the typical Norseman, and the freedom and dignity of this class was one of the most distinctive features of Norse society, giving it a more open and participatory character than many of the rigid feudal societies of medieval Europe. A free man had rights, to bear arms, to attend and speak at the assembly, to seek justice for wrongs, to manage his own affairs, and these rights were jealously guarded. And at the top were the jarls, the earls, the chieftains, the warrior aristocracy, the wealthy and powerful who owned great estates, commanded followings of warriors, led in war and raiding, and from whose ranks came the kings. The jarls were the leaders of Norse society, the great men whose wealth and warriors and reputation gave them power, who competed for status and followers and territory, who led the great expeditions and ruled the petty kingdoms. And above the jarls, in time, rose the kings, at first petty kings ruling small territories, and later, as the Viking Age progressed, the great kings who would unite Denmark, Norway, and Sweden into kingdoms. This threefold structure, thrall, freeman, and jarl, with the king above, gave Norse society its shape, hierarchical and unequal, resting on slavery at its base, but with a large and proud class of free men at its heart, and a tradition of law and assembly that gave it a distinctive character. For binding the whole society together was law, and the Norse were a remarkably law-minded people, governing themselves through the institution of the Thing, the assembly of free men. The Thing was the gathering where the free men of a district or a region or a whole country came together to make and declare the law, to settle disputes, to try cases, to conduct the public business of the community. There were local things and regional things, and, in Iceland, the great national thing, the Althing. At the Thing, disputes that might otherwise be settled by the blood feud could be brought before the assembly and judged according to law. Compensation could be fixed for injuries and killings. Outlaws could be declared. The law itself, held in memory and recited by the lawcod, could be consulted and applied. The Thing was a remarkable institution, a tradition of law and collective decision-making, and the limitation of arbitrary power, one of the great contributions of the Norse world, and an ancestor, in some ways, of later traditions of representative government and the rule of law. The Vikings were raiders and warriors, yes, but they were also a people of law, who governed themselves through assembly and custom, and prized their legal traditions as highly as their martial ones. The women of the Viking world held a position that, while far from equal by modern standards, was notably stronger and more independent than that of women in many other societies of their age. And the role of women in Norse society is one of its most interesting and distinctive features, worth pausing on as we explore the human world of the Vikings. Norse women could not, generally, attend the assembly, or hold political office, or lead in war, though the sagas and legends remember fierce shield maidens and warrior women, and there is some archaeological hint that a few women may indeed have been warriors. But within the domestic sphere and the management of the household and the farm, Norse women held real authority and independence. The wife of a Norse farmer was the mistress of the household. She held the keys to the storehouses, a symbol of her authority, and managed the farm and its provisions, the food and the textiles and the household economy, especially during the long months when her husband might be away raiding or trading or at the assembly. A capable wife effectively ran the farm and the household, wielding real economic and domestic power, and was a respected partner, rather than a mere dependent. And Norse women had legal rights that were notable for their time. A woman could own property and inherit it. She could, in many circumstances, initiate a divorce, a striking right, allowing a woman to leave a marriage that was abusive or unsatisfactory, declaring before witnesses her decision to divorce, and reclaiming her property. She could seek justice for wrongs done to her. She played a central role in the kinship networks and the honor culture, often remembered in the sagas as the keepers of family honor, the ones who urged vengeance and remembered wrongs, fierce and formidable figures who drove the action of many a saga. The women of the sagas are vivid and powerful characters, strong-willed, intelligent, proud, sometimes terrible in their pursuit of honor and vengeance. And while the sagas are literature, not documentary record, they reflect a society in which women were significant actors, respected and feared and reckoned with. Women also held important religious and magical roles. The practice of Sidra, a form of Norse magic associated with prophecy and the shaping of fate, was particularly associated with women, and the figure of the vulva, the seeress or prophetess who could see the future and commune with the spirits, was a respected and powerful one. Wandering seeresses who were welcomed and honored, consulted for their prophecies, holders of a deep and somewhat feared magical power. The great goddess Freyja was herself a mistress of Sidra, and the magical and prophetic arts were a sphere in which women held particular authority. From the mistress of the farm with her keys, to the saga heroine driving the feud, to the vulva with her prophecies, the women of the Norse world were figures of real substance and power within their society, not equal to men in the public and martial spheres, but independent, respected, legally empowered, and central to the life of the Norse world in a way that set them apart from women in many other medieval societies. What was it like to live in the Viking world? To wake and work and eat and sleep in the cold north 1,000 years ago? Let us pause among the ordinary textures of Norse daily life, the world of the farm and the hall and the hearth, the common existence that underlay all the raids and voyages and myths, for this too is part of the whole story of the Vikings. The center of Norse life was the longhouse, the long timber hall that served as the home of the family, and the heart of the farm. It was a long rectangular building, its walls of timber or wattle or turf depending on the region and the available materials, its roof thatched or turfed, with a single long room running its length, in the simpler houses, and a hearth, a long fire pit, running down the centre, where the fire burned for warmth and cooking and light, the smoke rising to escape through a hole in the roof. Along the walls ran raised benches or platforms, which served for sitting by day and sleeping by night. The family and the household ranged along the hall around the central fire. In the larger halls of the wealthy, there might be additional rooms, finer furnishings, carved and decorated woodwork, the high seat of the master of the house in the place of honor. But the basic pattern was the same: the long hall, the central hearth, the benches along the walls, the household gathered around the fire, a warm and smoky and crowded refuge against the cold and dark of the northern world. Life on the farm followed the rhythm of the northern seasons. The brief, intense summer was the time of greatest labor, the planting and tending and harvesting of the grain, the making of hay to feed the animals through the winter, the work that had to be packed into the short growing seasons. And it was also the season of raiding and trading and travel, when the men might sail off on their expeditions while the women managed the farms. The long, hard winter was the time of confinement and endurance. The animals kept alive in the barns on stored fodder, the household living on what had been preserved, the long dark days and longer nights passed in the smoky hall, working at indoor crafts, telling tales, waiting for the return of the light. The diet was what the farm and the sea and the hunt provided: bread and porridge from barley and oats, meat from the cattle and sheep and pigs, much of it preserved by salting or smoking or drying for the winter. Fish, fresh and preserved, a great staple of the coastal Norse. Milk and cheese and butter, what vegetables and fruits the short season allowed, and ale and mead for feasting, the drink central to Norse celebration and hospitality. And the Norse were craftsmen of great skill, and daily life was full of making. They were master woodworkers, as their ships attest, and worked wood for everything from buildings to furniture to tools, to the beautiful carved decoration they loved. They were skilled metalworkers, producing fine weapons and tools and exquisite jewellery, brooches and arm rings and necklaces of bronze and silver and gold, worked in the intricate interlacing animal styles that are the hallmark of Norse art. They were weavers and textile workers, the women producing the woolen cloth that clothed the people and made the great sails of the ships, a vast and essential labour. They worked bone and antler and leather. They carved and decorated and ornamented. They made beautiful things as well as useful ones, and their art, the intricate, swirling, interlaced patterns of beasts and serpents, vigorous and complex and beautiful, adorned their ships and their weapons and their jewellery and their carved stones. The daily life of the Norse was a life of hard work in a hard land, but also a life of skill and craft and beauty, of the warm hall against the cold night, of the family around the hearth, of the making of useful and beautiful things. The ordinary human foundation beneath the extraordinary age. At the heart of the Viking image, of course, is the warrior, and the Norse warrior was a formidable figure indeed, shaped by a culture that prized martial courage above almost all things, armed and trained for war, bound by a fierce code of honor and glory. Let us look at the Norse warrior, his weapons, his way of war, and the strange and terrifying figure of the berserker who stands at the extreme of the warrior ideal. The Norse warrior's weapons reflected his wealth and status. The most prized and prestigious weapon was the sword. A fine sword was a treasure, often beautifully made and decorated, sometimes given a name and handed down through generations, the weapon of the wealthy and the noble. But the most common weapons were the spear and the axe. The spear, the everyday weapon of the ordinary warrior, used for both throwing and thrusting, and the axe, the iconic Viking weapon, ranging from the ordinary tool that any farmer owned and could wield in battle, to the great two-handed battle axe, the fearsome long-hafted broad-bladed axe that became one of the signature weapons of the Norse, capable of terrible blows. For defense, the warrior carried the round shield, the large round wooden shield, often brightly painted, that was the Norse warrior's chief protection, used both defensively and as a weapon in the press of battle, and ranged along the sides of the longships. The wealthy might wear armour, a shirt of mail, the interlinked iron rings that protected the body, a precious and expensive thing, and a helmet of iron to protect the head. And here we should lay to rest the most famous myth of all. The Vikings did not wear horned helmets. The horned helmet is a later invention, a romantic fantasy of the 19th century. The real Norse helmet was a simple practical iron cap, or a helmet with a guard for the nose and eyes. No horns. The image is beloved but entirely false. The Norse way of war was, in its essence, the way of the individual warrior and the warband. Fierce, aggressive, built around personal courage and prowess, and the bonds of loyalty between a leader and his followers. The Vikings fought on foot, in formations like the shield wall. The line of warriors with overlapping shields, presenting a wall of wood and iron to the enemy, pushing and hacking in the brutal press of close combat, and around their leaders and their banners. Battle was close and bloody and personal, a matter of strength and courage and skill at arms, of the shield wall holding or breaking, of champions and their followings, and over it all hung the warrior ethos we have already glimpsed, the prizing of courage above life, the hope of Valhalla, the conviction that a brave death in battle was the finest of fates, the contempt for cowardice, the pursuit of glory and reputation. The Norse warrior fought not only for plunder or land or his lord, but for honor, for fame, for the good name that would outlive him, and the brave death that would carry him to the hall of the gods. And at the extreme edge of the warrior ideal stood the most terrifying figures of all, the berserkers. The berserkers were warriors who fought in a state of frenzied, ecstatic battle fury, the famous Norse battle rage, in which the warrior was seized by a kind of trance or madness, a furious frenzy in which he felt no pain and no fear, in which his strength seemed superhuman, in which he howled and raged and bit his shield and threw himself upon the enemy with terrible abandon. The very word berserk comes from these warriors, perhaps bear shirt, for some may have worn bear or wolf skins, associating themselves with the ferocity of the beast, fighting as if possessed by the animal's spirit. The berserker fury was associated with Odin, the god of battle frenzy and inspired madness, and the berserkers may have worked themselves into their state through ritual, through belief, through whatever means, but the result was a warrior who fought with a terrifying disregard for his own safety, immune to pain and fear, a frenzied engine of destruction that struck terror into enemies. The berserker is the warrior ideal carried to its furthest and most frightening extreme, the courage that becomes madness, the disregard for death that becomes ecstatic fury, the human warrior become a thing of pure battle rage. They were the shock troops and the terror weapons of the Norse, the most extreme expression of a culture that worshipped martial courage, and they have remained, ever after, one of the most vivid and frightening images of the Viking age. The Vikings are remembered as raiders and warriors, but they were also a people of words, of poetry, of a distinctive form of writing, of a deep reverence for the power of language and the craft of the poet. The world of Norse words, the runes, the poetry, the skalds who composed it, is an essential part of their culture, and reveals a people far more sophisticated and word-loving than the savage image of the raider suggests. The Norse had a system of writing. The runes, the angular letters of the runic alphabet, well suited to being carved into wood, stone, bone and metal, made up of straight lines that could be cut with a knife. The runes were used for many purposes, to mark ownership, to record names, to commemorate the dead, to send messages, and, importantly, for magic. For the runes were not merely letters, but were believed to hold power. We have seen how Odin himself sacrificed on the World-Tree to win the secret of the runes, and the Norse used runes in charms and spells, carving them to heal, to curse, to protect, to work magic of various kinds. Across the Norse world, and especially in Sweden, stand the rune stones, great standing stones carved with runic inscriptions, often raised to commemorate the dead, recording the names of those who had died, sometimes far away on Viking expeditions, telling in brief carved words of men who fell in England or the East, or who sailed to distant lands, a poignant and lasting memorial in stone, the voices of the Norse speaking still from their carved letters across 1,000 years. But the highest art of Norse words was poetry, for the Norse prized the poet's craft enormously, and skill in poetry was honoured alongside skill in war. Poetry was associated with Odin himself, the god of poetic inspiration as well as wisdom and war, who had won the very mead of poetry, the magical drink that conferred the gift of verse. And the Norse poets, the skalds, were figures of high honour, attached to the courts of kings and chieftains, composing intricate praise poetry to celebrate the deeds of their patrons, to commemorate battles and victories, to immortalise the great in verse. Skaldic poetry was extraordinarily complex and demanding, a highly wrought art of elaborate metre and intricate wordplay, and above all of the cunning, the distinctive Norse poetic device in which a thing is named, not directly, but through an elaborate metaphorical phrase. The sea becomes the whale road, or the swan's path. A ship becomes the steed of the waves. Gold becomes the fire of the sea, or Sif's hair. Battle becomes the storm of swords, or the meeting of blades. A warrior becomes the feeder of ravens, or the reddener of swords. These kennings, often drawing on the myths and legends for their references, made skaldic poetry a dense and elusive and difficult art, the mark of the master poet, prized and rewarded by kings, and the Norse preserved, in their poetry, not only the praise of kings but the great myths and legends themselves. For much of what we know of Norse mythology comes from the old poems, the verses that preserved the stories of the gods and the heroes. The world of Norse words, then, was rich and deep. The runes with their practical and magical power, the rune stones commemorating the dead, the skalds with their intricate honoured craft, the poetry preserving the myths and praising the great, the deep Norse reverence for the power of the word and the skill of the poet. The Vikings were warriors, but they were also makers of words, and they prized their poets as highly as their warriors. A reminder that the people of the dragon ships were also a people of profound verbal artistry and a deep love of language and story. For all the fame of Viking raiding, much of the Norse expansion was driven not by the sword, but by trade. For the Vikings were among the greatest merchants and traders of their age, building commercial networks that spanned from the Arctic to the Mediterranean to Central Asia, and much of their wealth and much of their reach came not from plunder, but from commerce. To see the Vikings only as raiders is to miss half their achievement. They were also traders of extraordinary reach and enterprise. The Norse trade networks were vast. In the west, Norse merchants traded throughout the British Isles, Francia, and the Atlantic settlements, carrying goods between the lands of their expansion. In the east, as we have seen, the Swedish Rus built a great trade route down the rivers of Russia to the Black Sea and the Caspian, to Constantinople and the markets of the Islamic Caliphate, carrying the products of the north southward and bringing back the wealth of the south, and above all silver, the Arab silver that flowed north in vast quantities in exchange for the goods of the Rus. And that has been found in great hoards throughout the Norse world, the profits of the eastern trade. The Norse founded trading towns that became great commercial centres: Hiddeby in the Danish lands, Birka in Sweden, Dublin in Ireland, Koppang in Norway, and others, bustling markets where goods from across the known world changed hands, where merchants from many lands met, where the products of the Arctic and the Atlantic and the East flowed together. And what did they trade? From the north came the products of the cold lands, furs, above all, the rich furs of the northern forests and the Arctic, highly prized in the markets of the south, walrus ivory, the tusks of the walrus, a precious substitute for elephant ivory, amber, the fossil resin of the Baltic, treasured for ornament, down and feathers, falcons, the prized hunting birds of the north, honey and wax, iron, soapstone, whetstones, dried fish, and, the darkest and one of the most profitable commodities, slaves, the captives taken in raids and war, sold throughout the Norse world and far beyond, a major and terrible part of the Norse economy. And in exchange came the goods of the wider world, silver above all, especially the Arab silver of the eastern trade, silk and fine textiles from Byzantium and the East, wine, glass, pottery, spices, weapons and fine metalwork, jewellery and ornaments, the luxuries and manufactures of the richer southern lands. The Norse merchant carried the goods of half the world along his trade routes, and the wealth of this commerce, the silver hoards, the foreign goods found in Norse graves and settlements, the great trading towns, testifies to the scale and reach of Viking trade. The merchant and the raider were often the same man, or two faces of the same enterprise. A Norseman might trade where he could, and raid where he could, the two activities shading into each other, the line between commerce and plunder not always sharp. But the point is that the Viking Age was as much an age of trade as of raiding, that the Norse built one of the great commercial networks of the medieval world, linking the Arctic and the Atlantic to Byzantium and the Caliphate and Central Asia, carrying goods and silver and slaves and ideas across thousands of miles, growing rich on commerce as well as on plunder. The dragon ship of the raider and the gnar of the merchant were both instruments of the Norse expansion, and the merchant's contribution to the wealth and reach and connectedness of the Viking world was every bit as great as the raiders. The Vikings were traders as well as warriors, and their commerce bound together a vast swath of the medieval world. As the Viking Age progressed, a great transformation came over the Norse homelands themselves. For out of the patchwork of petty kings and independent chieftains, ambitious rulers began to forge larger kingdoms, uniting the scattered territories of the north into the kingdoms of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, and changing the Norse world forever. The rise of these kingdoms, and the great kings who built them, is the political story of the later Viking Age, and it would lead in the end to the close of the age itself. In Norway, the work of unification is associated above all with Harald Fairhair, who, in the late 9th century, fought to bring the many petty kingdoms of Norway under his single rule. The saga tells a romantic tale of his motivation, that he wooed a proud woman who refused to marry him until he had made himself king of all Norway, and that he swore not to cut or comb his hair until he had achieved it, earning the nickname Tanglehair until his victory was complete, when he trimmed it and became Fair Hair. Whatever the truth of the legend, Harald did fight a series of campaigns to subdue the other kings and chieftains of Norway, culminating in a great sea battle in which he broke the power of his rivals and established himself as the first king of a united Norway. And his consolidation of power, breaking the independence of the old chieftains and free farmers, was, as we have seen, one of the spurs to the great emigration to Iceland, many proud Norsemen choosing to leave rather than submit to the new royal power. The unification of Norway under Harald Fairhair was a turning point, the beginning of the Norwegian kingdom, though it would take generations and many struggles before royal power was secure. In Denmark, the rise of kingship is associated especially with Harald Bluetooth, who ruled in the 10th century and who claimed, on a great rune stone he raised, to have won all of Denmark and Norway, and to have made the Danes Christian, a boast that captures the two great developments of his reign, the consolidation of the Danish kingdom and the beginning of the conversion to Christianity, which we will come to. Harald Bluetooth built great fortifications and public works, strengthened the Danish state, and presided over Denmark's transition from a patchwork of territories toward a unified Christian kingdom. And in a curious modern footnote, his name lives on in an unexpected place. The Bluetooth wireless technology is named after Harald Bluetooth, who united peoples as the technology unites devices, its very symbol formed from the runes of his initials. A 1,000-year-old Viking king remembered every time we connect our devices, and the greatest of all the Viking kings, the one who built the largest empire and stood at the height of Norse royal power, was Canute the Great, Canute, who in the early 11th century ruled a great North Sea empire spanning Denmark, Norway, and, most remarkably, England. For the Danish kings had returned to the conquest of England in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, and Canute, a Danish prince, completed the conquest and made himself king of England, ruling it not as a raider, but as its crowned and lawful king, and ruling it well, a strong, capable, and respected monarch who brought peace and good government to England, and ruled it as part of a great Scandinavian empire. Cullen ruled England, Denmark, and Norway together, a North Sea empire uniting much of the Norse world and the richest of its conquests under a single Viking crown, the high watermark of Norse royal power, a Danish king reigning as one of the greatest monarchs in Europe. To Clun belongs the famous and often misunderstood story of his commanding the tide not to rise, which he did, the tale says, not out of arrogance, but to demonstrate to his flattering courtiers the limits of even a king's power, that only God could command the sea, a wise king rebuking flattery. Under Knut, the Viking world reached a kind of political summit, Norse kings ruling great Christian kingdoms, the raiders' descendants become the crowned monarchs of the north and of England. But Knut's empire did not long outlive him, and the Viking Age was, in fact, drawing toward its close, and its ending would come, fittingly, on a battlefield in England, in a year that would change the world. Every age has its end, and the Viking Age, which had begun with the raid on Lindisfarne in 1793, came to its close, by a kind of historical symmetry, in England in the year 1066, one of the most famous dates in all of history, in a great battle that marked both the last great Viking invasion and the end of the Viking Age itself. The story of that ending is dramatic and fitting, and it centers on one last great Viking warrior king, Harald Hardrada, Harald the Hard Ruler, King of Norway, the last great Viking. Harald Hardrada was a Viking of the old heroic mold, and his life had been an epic of the whole Norse world. As a young man, after a defeat in Norway, he had fled east and travelled the great river road to Constantinople, where he had served for years in the Varangian Guard, the Norse bodyguard of the Byzantine Emperor, fighting in the Emperor's wars across the Mediterranean and the Middle East, winning fame and treasure in adventures from Sicily to the Holy Land, before returning north, fabulously wealthy and renowned, to claim the throne of Norway. He was the last of the great Viking warrior kings, a giant of a man, a famous warrior, ambitious and formidable, the very embodiment of the Viking spirit in its final generation. And in 1066, Harald Hardrada launched one last great Viking invasion, a bid to conquer England, sailing across the North Sea with a great fleet and army to seize the English throne. The year 1066 was a moment of crisis for England, with multiple claimants contending for its crown after the death of its king, and Harald Hardrada was one of them, invading the north of England with his Norwegian army and a claim to the throne. He landed in the north, won an initial victory, and seemed poised to make himself master of England. But the English king, Harold Godwinson, marched north with astonishing speed and fell upon the Norwegian army by surprise at Stamford Bridge, near York. And at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the English destroyed the last great Viking army. Harald Hardrada was killed, struck down, the sagas say, by an arrow in the throat, and his invasion was annihilated, the Norwegian host so thoroughly defeated that the survivors needed only a fraction of the ships they had come in to carry the remnant home. The last great Viking king lay dead on an English field, his bid to conquer England broken, and with him, symbolically, died the Viking Age. The age of the great Norse invasions, begun at Lindisfarne, ended at Stamford Bridge, and here history wove one of its most dramatic patterns. For the English victory at Stamford Bridge was won at a terrible cost, and only days later, for even as Harold Godwinson defeated the Vikings in the north, another invader had landed in the south, William, Duke of Normandy, himself, as we have seen, a descendant of the Viking Rollo, the Northmen whose ancestors had settled in France. Harold, his army exhausted and depleted from the desperate battle at Stamford Bridge, had to turn at once and march the length of England to face this new threat. And at the Battle of Hastings, the weary English army was defeated, and Harold Godwinson was killed, and William the Conqueror won the throne of England. So the year 1066 saw 2 invasions and 2 battles. The old Vikings under Harald Hardrada defeated at Stamford Bridge, the end of the old Viking Age, and the new Normans under William, the Christianized, Frenchified descendants of the Vikings, victorious at Hastings, the beginning of a new age. The Viking Age ended, in a sense, with both battles at once. The old-style Vikings destroyed in the north, and England conquered by the Vikings' own descendants from the south. The wheel had come full circle. The age of the dragon ships was over. The age that the Vikings had helped to make was beginning. The Viking Age ended not only on the battlefield, but in the soul. For over the course of the age, a great transformation came over the Norse world that was, in the long run, even more profound than the rise of kingdoms or the end of the raids. The conversion of the Norse from their old gods to Christianity, the fading of Odin and Thor, and the whole magnificent mythology before the cross of Christ. The Christianization of the North was the deepest change of all, the end of the old religion that had animated the whole Viking spirit, and it transformed the Norse world forever. The conversion came gradually, over the course of the Viking Age and beyond, by many means. The Norse encountered Christianity everywhere they went. In the Christian lands they raided and traded with and settled in, where many Norse settlers adopted the faith of the peoples among whom they lived. Christian missionaries came north into Scandinavia, preaching the new faith, winning converts, slowly establishing the church in the Norse homelands. And, crucially, the kings converted. For as the Norse kingdoms rose, their kings increasingly adopted Christianity, both from genuine conviction and for reasons of power and prestige and connection to the Christian world of Europe. And the conversion of a king meant pressure, often heavy pressure, for the conversion of his people. Harald Bluetooth of Denmark proclaimed the conversion of the Danes. The kings of Norway, some of them forcibly and violently, pressed Christianity upon their people. And across the Norse world, over generations, the old religion gave way to the new. It was not always peaceful or willing. There was resistance, sometimes fierce, for the old gods were deeply rooted, and many Norsemen clung to the faith of their ancestors, to Thor and Odin and the old ways, and resented and resisted the new religion pressed upon them by missionaries and kings. There were conflicts, martyrdoms, forced conversions, and long periods when the old and the new faith existed side by side, when a Norseman might honor both Christ and Thor, hedging his bets, when the symbols of both faiths appeared together. In Iceland, the conversion was famously accomplished by a decision of the Althing, the assembly, around the year 1000. The Icelanders, to avoid civil strife between the Christian and pagan factions, agreed to accept Christianity as the public religion, while, for a time, allowing the old practices to continue in private, a characteristically Icelandic legal compromise that converted the country without bloodshed. But everywhere, in the end, the old gods faded. Odin and Thor and Freyr and the whole great company dethroned, their worship abandoned, their temples thrown down or converted, the cross raised in their place. And yet the old gods did not entirely die, for, as in the Celtic lands, much of the old world survived in transformed and hidden ways. The myths themselves were preserved, written down by the Christian Icelanders who loved the old stories even as they abandoned the old faith, so that the mythology survived as literature and heritage even after it died as religion. The old festivals and customs lingered, absorbed into the Christian calendar. The names of the gods survived in the days of the week: Tyr's Day, Odin's, Woden's Day, Thor's Day, Freya's Day, giving us Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday in the English tongue. The old Norse and Germanic gods remembered every week to this day. The old stories, the old spirit, the old courage entered into the literature and the memory and the identity of the Norse lands. The gods were dethroned, but they were not forgotten. They passed from living faith into undying story, where they remain, as vivid and powerful as ever, to this day. The conversion ended the old religion, but the old gods, like the Tuatha De Danann under their hills, withdrew into story and memory, and there they live still. The Viking Age ended, but the Vikings did not vanish. They became, rather, woven into the fabric of the world they had spent 3 centuries reshaping, leaving a legacy so deep and so wide that it endures, in countless ways, to this day. To follow the story of the Vikings to its proper end is to see how much of the modern world bears, still, the mark of the Northmen. The dragon ships are gone, but their wake still spreads across history. Consider the map of Europe, which the Vikings redrew. They founded Normandy, whose Norman descendants would conquer England in 1066 and reshape English history, language and society forever, so that every English speaker carries, in the French-derived half of the language, the indirect legacy of the Vikings who settled the Seine. They founded the first Russian state, Kievan Rus, giving Russia its first rulers and perhaps its very name. They settled large parts of England, the Danelaw, leaving a deep imprint on English place names, on the English language. Countless everyday English words are of Norse origin, and on the people of northern and eastern England. They founded the first towns of Ireland, including Dublin. They settled Scotland's northern isles and parts of its coasts. They settled Iceland, creating a nation that endures to this day, and the Faroe Islands. They reached Greenland and North America, across a vast swath of the world, from Russia to America. The Vikings founded states, settled lands, mingled their blood with the peoples they came among, and left a genetic and cultural and linguistic legacy that persists in the populations and the place names and the languages of half of Europe and beyond. Consider, too, the deeper cultural legacies. The Norse tradition of law and assembly, the thing, the gathering of free men to make law and settle disputes, contributed to the development of representative institutions and the rule of law. The very word for the parliaments of some Scandinavian countries derives from the thing, and Iceland's Althing claims to be among the oldest parliaments in the world. The Norse spirit of seafaring and exploration, the daring that crossed open oceans to unknown lands, stands as one of the great chapters in the history of human exploration and discovery. The Norse art, with its intricate interlacing beasts and vigorous decorative power, influenced the art of the lands they touched. And the Norse mythology and literature, the sagas, the Eddas, the great cycle of myth and legend, became one of the treasures of world culture. A body of story that has inspired writers and artists ever since, that gave the modern world Tolkien's Middle-earth, drawn deeply from Norse myth, and Wagner's operas and 1,000 other works, that remains as vivid and influential as ever in the modern imagination. And consider how the Vikings live on in the imagination itself, for few peoples of the past have so gripped the modern mind as the Vikings, who have become one of the great romantic images of history. The dragon ships and the raiders, the explorers and the gods, Odin and Thor and Ragnarök, the whole magnificent and terrible and fascinating world of the Norse, endlessly retold in books and films and games and art, a permanent fixture of the modern imagination. The real Vikings were complex. Raiders and traders, slavers and lawgivers, destroyers and creators, the makers of terror and the makers of beauty. But in all their complexity, they left a mark on the world, out of all proportion to their numbers and their cold remote homeland, redrawing the map, founding nations, crossing oceans, creating one of the great mythologies, and burning themselves into the human imagination forever. The Northmen came out of the cold grey sea, and the world was never the same. We have spoken of how the Norse myths and history were preserved in Iceland, but the achievement is so remarkable and so important to everything we know of the Vikings that it deserves a closer look. For the survival of the Norse memory, the writing down of the sagas and the myths is one of the great cultural achievements of the medieval world, and the reason we can tell the story of the Vikings at all. Almost everything we know of the inner life of the Norse, their myths, their legends, their values, their stories, comes to us from Iceland and from one of the most extraordinary literary flowerings in human history. After Iceland's conversion to Christianity around the year 1000, the Icelanders learnt the art of writing with the Latin alphabet, brought by the Church, and they turned this new tool to an astonishing purpose: the preservation of their own history, traditions and stories. In the 12th, 13th and 14th centuries, Icelandic scholars and writers produced a vast body of literature in their own Norse language. The sagas, the great prose narratives that are Iceland's supreme contribution to world literature. There were the family sagas, the sagas of Icelanders, which told the stories of the settlement of Iceland and the lives and feuds and fates of the early Icelandic families, realistic and powerful narratives of honor and vengeance and character that are among the masterpieces of medieval literature, strikingly modern in their realism and psychological depth. There were the king's sagas, the histories of the kings of Norway and the other Norse lands. There were the legendary sagas, telling of ancient heroes and mythical events. And there were the great mythological works, the poetic Edda and Snorri Sturluson's prose Edda, that preserved the mythology itself. It is hard to overstate what a remarkable thing this was, that a tiny, remote, poor nation on a subarctic island, with a population of only a few tens of thousands, produced in the medieval period one of the great literatures of the world, preserving not only its own history, but the mythology and heroic legends of the entire Norse world. Without the Icelanders, we would know almost nothing of Norse mythology. Odin and Thor and Loki, Ragnarök and Valhalla and the World-Tree, the whole magnificent cosmos, would be lost to us but for a few scattered fragments. Without the Icelanders, the history of the Viking Age would be known only from the hostile chronicles of their victims. It was Iceland that remembered, Iceland that wrote it down, Iceland that preserved the voice and the spirit and the stories of the Norse for all the ages after. The empty island, settled by freedom-loving exiles, became the memory of the whole Norse world, and the literature it produced, the sagas and the Eddas, is the priceless inheritance through which the Vikings still speak to us across the centuries, the keepers of the memory who saved the Norse spirit from oblivion. Of all the things the Vikings were, raiders, traders, lawgivers, poets, myth-makers, perhaps the most admirable and the most purely astonishing was their character as explorers, as the people who, more than any others of their age, dared the open ocean and the unknown, who pushed out beyond the edge of the known world again and again, who crossed seas no one had crossed and found lands no one had found. The Viking spirit of exploration deserves a moment of its own, for it is one of the great chapters in the long human story of venturing into the unknown. Think of what they did. In an age when most sailors hugged the coasts, fearful of the open sea, the Norse struck out across the open North Atlantic, one of the most dangerous oceans on earth, cold and stormy and vast, in open boats, without compass or chart, navigating by the sun and stars and the signs of the sea, and they found their way. They found and settled Iceland, hundreds of miles out in the empty ocean. They pushed on to Greenland, across even wilder seas, and built colonies at the very edge of the habitable Arctic world. And they pushed on still farther, across the last unknown stretch of ocean, to the shores of North America, reaching a new continent 500 years before Columbus, the first Europeans to set foot in the New World. In the east, they pushed up the rivers of Russia to the Black Sea and Constantinople. In the south, they raided the coasts of Spain, entered the Mediterranean, reached North Africa and Italy. There was scarcely a corner of the European world, and beyond it, that the Norse did not reach. They were the great venturers of their age, pushing the boundaries of the known world outward in every direction. And what drove them? Many things, no doubt. The search for wealth, for land, for plunder, for trade, for escape from crowded homelands or overbearing kings. But there was also surely something deeper, a restlessness, a daring, a willingness to face the unknown that was woven into the Norse spirit, the same spirit that produced a mythology of gods who face their doom with courage, of warriors who seek glory in the teeth of fate. The Norse were not a timid people. They did not cling to safety. They ventured, they dared, They pushed out into the dark and the cold and the unknown, across oceans and into strange lands, seeking what lay beyond the horizon. The dragon prow gazing forward across the unknown sea is the very emblem of this spirit. The readiness to go where none had gone, to dare what none had dared, to face the unknown ocean and the unknown shore with the same courage their gods showed in the face of doom. It is one of the great and admirable things about the Vikings, this spirit of exploration and daring, and it carried them, in their open boats across their cold seas, farther than any Europeans of their age, all the way to the shores of a new world. Before we gather the whole of the story together, let us pause on one more aspect of the Norse world that reveals the depth and richness beneath the warrior's image, the world contained in their language and their imagination, the way the Norse saw and named the world around them, which survives in the kennings and the poetry and the very texture of their thought. For a people are revealed in how they speak of the world, and the Norse spoke of it with a dark poetic brilliance that tells us much about their souls. We have met the kennings, the elaborate metaphorical phrases by which Norse poetry named things indirectly, the sea as the whale road, gold as the fire of the sea, battle as the storm of swords. But the kennings are more than a poetic device. They are a window into the Norse imagination, into the way these people saw their world. Consider how they named the sea, not with a single flat word, but with a horde of images. The whale road, the swan's path, the seal's bath, the way of the ship, the field of the sea king's lands. Each kenning is a tiny poem, a way of seeing the sea freshly, of capturing some aspect of it, its vastness, its danger, its role as the road of the seafarer, the home of the whale and the seal. The Norse looked at their cold grey ocean and saw not one thing but many, named it a dozen poetic ways, held it in a horde of images, and so with all the great things of their world, battle and gold and ships and warriors and death, each named in many poetic ways, each held in a treasury of images, the world seen richly and freshly and darkly through the lens of the poetic imagination. This love of the word, this richness of imagery, this poetic way of seeing, reveals a people far deeper and more imaginative than the savage raider of legend. The Norse were makers of images and weavers of words, who looked at their hard, cold world and transformed it through poetry into something rich and strange, who saw the sea as a road of whales and gold, as the fire of the deep, and battle as a storm of iron. Their imagination was dark and grand and beautiful, fitted to their hard northern world, an imagination of cold seas and grey skies, and the green fire in the heavens, of doom and courage, and the brave facing of fate, of gods who fall, and worlds that burn and rise again, and all of it is held, still, in the word hoard they left behind, in the poems and the sagas and the kennings, in the language and the literature through which their imagination still speaks. To enter the Norse word hoard is to enter a whole way of seeing the world, dark, brave, poetic, grand, the inner world of a people who lived hard and dreamed deep at the cold edge of the world. We have journeyed far tonight, across the cold grey seas and through the long centuries, from the first raid to the last king, from the creation of the world out of fire and ice to its ending at Ragnarök and its rebirth beyond. Before the night fully closes, let us gather the whole of it together in our minds and see the great shape of the story we have followed, the entire saga of the Vikings, the Northmen, the people of the cold grey sea. We began with the land that made them the hard, cold north, the fjords and forests and flat Danish islands, the homeland that turned the Norse toward the sea and shaped them into seafarers. We saw their world before the storm, the farmers and chieftains and free men, the society of honour and law and kinship, the old gods and the old ways. We saw the thing that made it all possible, the ship, the beautiful deadly longship, and the sturdy ocean-crossing Nar, and the seamanship that let the Norse cross the open ocean by the sun and the stars and the signs of the sea. And then we saw the storm break, the raid on Lindisfarne, the coming of the Northmen, the age of raids spreading across Europe, the dragon ships striking out of the sea. We followed them across the world, to England, the great heathen army, the shattering of the kingdoms, Alfred the Great and the last stand of Wessex, the Danelaw, the forging of England in the Viking wars, to Francia, the siege of Paris, the birth of Normandy, Rouleau and the Northmen who would become the Normans and conquer England in their turn, to the east, the Rus on the rivers of Russia, the first Russian state, the long road to Constantinople and the Varangian Guard in the great city, and across the open ocean to the west, to Iceland and its free commonwealth, to Erik the Red and Greenland, to Leif Erikson and the shores of Vinland, the Vikings reaching America 500 years before Columbus. And we went into their inner world, the magnificent cold mythology of the Norse. We climbed the World-Tree Yggdrasil and saw the 9 worlds hanging in its branches. We met one-eyed Odin the Allfather, who hung on the tree to win the runes, red-bearded Thor with his hammer, the protector, cunning Loki the trickster, who would bring the end, the Vanir and Freya and all the company of the gods. We heard the creation out of fire and ice, and the body of the slain giant Ymir, the adventures of Thor among the giants, the death of bright Baldr through Loki's malice, the binding of Loki in torment, and we heard the greatest and darkest story of all, Ragnarök, the doom of the gods, the foretold end in which the gods ride out to a battle they cannot win, and fall fighting against the fire and the chaos, and the world burns and sinks beneath the sea, and rises again, green and new, with Baldr returning, and life beginning anew. We saw Valhalla, the hall of the slain, and the Valkyries, and the Norse vision of fate, and the courage it bred, the brave facing of an inescapable doom that is the very heart of the Norse spirit. And we returned to the human world, the society of thralls and free men and jarls, the law and the thing, the women of the north with their keys and their rights and their fierce saga honor, the daily life of the hall and the hearth, the warrior and the berserker, the runes and the skalds and the poetry, the merchants and the vast trade networks, the kings who forged the northern kingdoms, the end of the age at Stamford Bridge, the conversion to Christianity and the fading of the old gods into undying story, and the vast legacy of the Northmen, written into the map and the languages and the laws and the imagination of half the world. It is a vast and grand and many-sided saga, the story of the Vikings, raiders and traders, explorers and settlers, warriors and poets, myth-makers and lawgivers, who came out of the cold grey sea and reached across the world and burned themselves forever into the memory of mankind. Beyond the gods and beyond the history, the Norse cherished a third great body of story, the heroic legends, the tales of mortal heroes and ancient kings, half history and half myth, that filled the long winter nights in the halls and were preserved, like the myths, in the sagas and poems of Iceland. These legendary heroes were as beloved as the gods themselves, and their stories, of dragon slayers and cursed gold, of doomed love and terrible vengeance, of warriors who sought glory in the teeth of fate, expressed the Norse spirit as fully as any myth. Let us hear something of these heroes before our journey closes. The most famous of the Viking Age heroes, half legendary, is Ragnar Lothbrok, Ragnar Hairy Breeches, the great Viking warrior king of legend, whose sons, the sagas say, led the great heathen army against England. Ragnar is a figure where history and legend blur. There may have been a real Viking leader or leaders behind the legend, but the Ragnar of the sagas is a creature of story, a mighty and famous Viking who raided far and wide, won great victories, and married remarkable women, including, in the legend, a shield maiden and a wise queen. And his death became one of the most famous of all Viking legends. Captured at last by an English king, Ragnar was cast into a pit of venomous snakes to die, and there, as the serpents bit him, the old warrior is said to have sung his death song, defiant to the end, laughing at death, declaring that his sons would avenge him, and prophesying, in the famous line, how the young pigs would grunt when they learnt how the old boar had died, and avenge him they did, the sagas say. For the sons of Ragnar, hearing of their father's death, gathered the great heathen army and fell upon England to take their terrible vengeance, conquering kingdoms and slaying kings in the name of the old boar who had died singing in the snake pit. Whether or not any of it is true, the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok, the mighty Viking who laughed at death, and the avenging sons who conquered England, captures the Viking spirit of defiant courage and the duty of vengeance as fully as any tale. But the greatest of all the Norse heroic legends, the central story of Germanic heroic myth, is the legend of the Volsungs, the tale of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, the cursed gold, and the doom that flowed from it, one of the most powerful and influential stories in all of European literature. It is a long and tragic saga of many parts, but at its heart is Sigurd, or Siegfried, the greatest of heroes, and his slaying of the dragon Fafnir. Fafnir was a being who, through greed, had transformed himself into a great dragon to guard a hoard of cursed gold, gold that carried a terrible curse, bringing doom to all who possessed it. Sigurd, the young hero, guided by the cunning smith Regin, Fafnir's own brother, who coveted the gold, forged a mighty sword and went to slay the dragon. He dug a pit in the path the dragon took to drink, and when the great beast passed over him, Sigurd thrust his sword up into its heart from below, slaying the dragon. And then, the legend says, Sigurd tasted the dragon's blood, and suddenly understood the language of the birds, who warned him that the treacherous Regin meant to kill him for the gold, and so Sigurd slew Regin too, and took the cursed hoard for himself. But the curse on the gold worked its doom, as it always does in such tales. Sigurd's later story is one of tragedy, of a doomed love, of a Valkyrie or shield maiden whom he wins and then, through magic and deception and the machinations of others, loses and betrays, of a web of love and jealousy and vengeance among kings and queens and heroes, and at last of Sigurd's murder and the terrible cascade of vengeance and destruction that follows, the cursed gold bringing death to all who touch it, the whole great house brought down in blood. The Volsung legend is a vast, tragic epic of heroism and doom, of the greatest of heroes brought down by the curse and the web of fate, of love and betrayal and vengeance played out among gods and heroes and cursed gold. And it has echoed through the centuries since. It is the ultimate source of the medieval German Nibelungenlied, and through it of Wagner's great opera cycle The Ring of the Nibelung. It shaped Tolkien and 1,000 other works. The Dragon Slayer and the cursed gold and the doom that flows from it have become some of the deepest patterns in all of Western story. The Norse heroes, Ragnar and his snake pit, Sigurd and his dragon, and his cursed gold, live on, as vivid as the gods, the mortal embodiments of the Norse ideal of glory sought in the face of doom. We have spoken much of the Norse gods and their myths, but little of how the Norse actually worshipped them, of the religious practices of the Viking Age, the rituals and sacrifices and holy places through which the Norse honored Odin and Thor, and the powers of their world. The religion of the Vikings was not a matter of books or creeds or churches, but of practice and festival and sacrifice, woven into the rhythm of the year and the life of the community, and it is worth understanding as the living faith behind the great mythology. The central act of Norse worship was the sacrifice, the blot, the offering made to the gods to win their favor, to ensure good harvests and good fortune and victory, to mark the turning of the seasons and the great occasions of life. The blot involved the sacrifice of animals, horses, cattle, pigs, and other beasts, whose blood was sprinkled on the altars and the participants and the walls of the holy place, and whose flesh was then cooked and eaten in a great communal feast, a sacred meal shared between the worshippers and, in a sense, the gods. The feast was central, the gathering of the community to eat the sacrificial meat and drink the sacred ale, toasting the gods, the whole community bound together in the shared ritual meal. These sacrificial feasts marked the great festivals of the Norse year, the midwinter feast of Yule, the great celebration in the dead of winter that would later merge into Christmas, the spring and autumn festivals marking the agricultural year, the special sacrifices before great undertakings like war or voyages. Through the blot, the Norse maintained their relationship with the gods, honored the powers that governed their world, and bound their communities together in shared ritual. There were holy places, sacred groves, sacred springs, and temples or halls where the worship was conducted. The sources describe great temples, the most famous being a temple said to have stood at Uppsala in Sweden, a major centre of the old religion, where, the chroniclers report, great sacrifices were held, including, the most lurid and debated of the accounts, human sacrifices. The bodies of men and animals hung in the sacred grove as offerings to the gods. How much of this is accurate and how much is the exaggeration of hostile Christian writers is debated. Human sacrifice did occur in the Norse world, at least on some occasions and in some forms, but its frequency and exact nature are uncertain. What is clear is that the Norse had holy places, temples, groves, springs, where the gods were worshipped and the sacrifices made, centers of the old religion scattered across the Norse world, until the coming of Christianity threw them down. And there were the religious specialists and the magical practitioners, the chieftains and kings who often led the public worship, for religious and political authority were intertwined, and the practitioners of Cedar and the seers, especially the Velva, the wandering prophetess we have met, who held a particular and somewhat feared spiritual power, who could see the future and commune with the spirits and work magic, and who was welcomed and honored and consulted. Norse religion, then, was a religion of practice and community, and the turning year, of the sacrificial feast, the holy place, the seasonal festival, the prophecy and the magic, a living faith woven into the fabric of Norse life, the worship behind the mythology that bound the community to its gods, and its gods to the rhythm of the world. It was this living religion that Christianity replaced, and understanding it helps us see what was lost and changed when the old gods faded and the cross was raised in the holy places of the north. We began our journey with the Viking ship, the foundation of the whole Viking age, and it is fitting, as we near the end, to return to the ships, and to the remarkable way that some of the greatest of them have come down to us across 1,000 years, not as wrecks on the seafloor, but buried in the earth, in the graves of the great, preserved as if by a miracle for the modern world to find. For the Norse buried some of their most honoured dead in their ships, and a few of these ship burials have survived, giving us our most precious and astonishing window into the Viking world. The Norse, as we have seen, revered their ships, and the ship was bound up with their ideas of death and the journey to the next world. The greatest among them, kings, chieftains, great ladies, were sometimes given the most magnificent of funerals, buried in a real ship, a sea-going vessel hauled up onto the land and set in a great pit, the dead laid within it, surrounded by rich grave goods, weapons, jewelry, tools, food, animals, sometimes sacrificed servants, everything they might need or had treasured in life, the whole ship and its contents then covered over with a great mound of earth, a ship grave, the dead sailing on into the next world in the vessel that had carried them in this one. Most of these ship graves have long since vanished or been plundered, but a few, by extraordinary fortune, survived intact in conditions that preserved even the wood, and their excavation in modern times has been among the great treasures of archaeology. The most famous are the great Norwegian ship burials, above all the Oseberg ship and the Gokstad ship, magnificent Viking vessels buried in mounds and preserved in the blue clay of the earth for over 1,000 years, recovered in remarkable condition. The Oseberg ship is a wonder, a beautiful, elaborately carved vessel, buried with 2 women of evidently high rank, surrounded by an astonishing wealth of grave goods, carved wooden objects of exquisite craftsmanship, textiles, a wagon, sledges, tools, animals, everything preserved by the clay, giving us an unparalleled view of Viking art and craft and daily life and burial custom. The Gokstad ship is a great sea-going vessel, sturdy and seaworthy, buried with a powerful man and his goods. These ships, and others like them, are the real things, actual Viking ships, 1,000 years old, that we can see and study, the very vessels of the age, with all their beauty of line and craft of construction laid bare. From them, and from the ships found sunk in harbours and waterways, we have learnt how the Viking ships were truly built, how they were shaped and fastened and rigged, the marvellous engineering that made the Viking age possible. To stand before one of these recovered ships, the long, graceful, curving hull, the overlapping oak planks, the carved prow, the lines as beautiful and functional as anything ever built, is to come as close as we can to touching the Viking world directly, to see with our own eyes the instrument of the whole age, the dragon ship of the raider and the ocean crosser of the explorer, the beautiful deadly vessel that carried the Norse out of their fjords and across the world, the ships beneath the earth, buried with the honoured dead to carry them into the next world, have carried something else across the centuries, the truth of the Viking ship, the foundation of everything, preserved in the clay for 1,000 years and given back to us at last. We began with the ship gliding out of the mist. We end with the ship lifted from the earth, the same beautiful vessel, the heart of the Viking age, come down to us across the long centuries. We have seen the Vikings largely through their own eyes, through the sagas and myths and poems that the Norse and their Icelandic descendants left behind, and through the terrified eyes of the Christian chroniclers whose monasteries they burned. But there is another set of eyes through which we can glimpse the Norse, and they give us one of the most vivid and remarkable accounts of the Vikings that survives. The eyes of travellers and observers from the rich and sophisticated civilizations to the south and east, who met the Norse on the trade routes and at the courts and on the great rivers, and who wrote down what they saw with the fascination of strangers encountering a strange people. To see the Vikings as the wider world saw them is to round out our picture of who they were. For a people are revealed not only in how they remember themselves, but in the impression they leave upon the strangers who behold them, and the Norse left a deep and lasting impression upon everyone they met. The most famous of these outside witnesses was an emissary from the Islamic world, a learned and observant man who in the 10th century travelled north and east on a diplomatic mission, and there encountered the Rus, the Eastern Vikings, on the great river of their trade, and wrote down a detailed account of what he saw. His description is one of the treasures of Viking history, for it gives us an eyewitness view, by a civilized and curious outsider, of the Norse as they actually were on the trade routes of the East. He described the Rus as a striking people, Tall and impressive, fair, tattooed, armed always with their weapons, traders in furs and slaves who had come down the long rivers from the north to the markets of the south. He observed their customs with the keen, sometimes disapproving, sometimes admiring eye of a man from a more settled and refined civilization. Their habits, their cleanliness, or lack of it by his standards, their trade, their gods, their ways, and above all, he left a famous and extraordinary account of a Norse funeral, the burial of a great chieftain among the Rus, which he witnessed in full and described in unforgettable detail. It was a ship funeral, of the kind we have spoken of. The dead chieftain laid in his ship with great ceremony, surrounded by rich goods and offerings, dressed in fine clothes, attended by elaborate ritual over many days, and at last sent into the next world in a great blaze, the ship and the dead and the offerings consumed together in a towering fire that lit the river and the sky, the chieftain departing this world in flame and smoke, sailing on into whatever lay beyond. The account is solemn and strange and powerful, full of ritual and belief, and the deep Norse conviction that the dead sailed on, that the great were sent into the next world in their ships with all they would need, that fire and the river carried the soul onward. The witness recorded the words of one of the Norse, who, watching the flames consume the dead chieftain and his ship, explained the belief behind the blazing send-off, that the fire was a kindness, carrying the dead swiftly and gloriously into the next world rather than leaving him to rot slowly in the cold earth. The flame a door flung open to the beyond. It is one of the most vivid windows we have into the Norse mind and the Norse vision of death. The ship, the fire, the sending on, the conviction that death was a voyage and the dead a traveller bound for another shore. And there were other outside witnesses who saw the Norse in other places. The Byzantines, who knew the Varangians, the great axe-wielding Norse guardsmen of the emperor, wrote of them with respect, of their loyalty, their ferocity, their formidable presence in the great city, these towering northern warriors who had travelled half the world to guard the emperor of the Romans. Christian writers across Europe recorded the Norse with fear and loathing, but sometimes too with a grudging recognition of their courage and their skill. Through all these outside eyes, the Islamic emissary on the river, the Byzantines in their golden city, the Christian monks in their threatened lands, we glimpsed the Vikings as the wider world encountered them, a striking, formidable, fascinating people, tall and fair and armed and bold, traders and warriors and travellers who appeared on every frontier of the civilized world, a people from the cold edge of things who had come, somehow, to range across the whole of it. To the settled civilizations of the south and east, the Norse were a wonder and a terror and a fascination. Strange travellers out of the cold north, with their dragon ships and their fire funerals and their pagan gods, appearing on the rivers and the coasts and at the courts, the people of the far north who had reached, astonishingly, into the very heart of the world. What these outside accounts give us, above all, is distance. The chance to see the Norse not as they wished to be remembered, in the heroic light of their own sagas, nor only as the demons of the chronicles they raided, but as they appeared to curious strangers who had no stake in flattering or condemning them, who simply watched and wrote down what they saw. And what those strangers saw was a people of striking presence and strange custom and far reach. Men who had come impossibly far from their cold homeland, who traded and fought and worshipped and buried their dead in ways that fascinated the observers of richer lands, who seemed to belong to the edge of the world and yet turned up at its centre. The Norse did not write history as the southern civilizations did. They left no great chronicles of their own deeds in their pagan age, only the poems and the memories that Iceland would later set down. And so these outside witnesses, with their curious watching eyes, fill in something the Norse could not record of themselves, the living impression they made upon the world, the wonder and unease and fascination they stirred wherever they appeared, the sheer strange vividness of the Northmen as the wider world beheld them. Through the eyes of the witness from the south, the river funeral blazes still, the ship burns down to the waterline, the smoke rises into the northern night, and the dead chieftain sails on into the beyond. And we, 1,000 years later, watch it with the same wonder. And in the eyes of these outside witnesses, as in the sagas of their own people, the Vikings live on, the Northmen, the Rus, the Varangians, the seafarers of the cold grey sea, seen and remembered and wondered at across 1,000 years. And now our long voyage comes to its end, traveller, and it is time to let the cold grey sea grow quiet, and the dragon ship drift, and the green fire fade gently from the sky. We have sailed the whole length of the Viking Age tonight, from the first raid to the last king, from the creation of the world to its doom and its rebirth. and now the journey draws to its close, and there is nothing left to do but rest. So let your body grow heavy and still, and let the long story carry you down, softly, into sleep. Let the great map of it all settle over you now like a warm cloak in the dark. Not as things to remember, for there is nothing to hold on to now, nothing to do but drift, but only as quiet images moving past in the gathering dark, growing softer and dimmer as you sink toward sleep. The cold grey northern sea, heaving slowly under a low sky, the fjords reaching far inland between their walls of stone, the long ship gliding out of the mist, its dragon prow lifting against the stars, its red sail bellying in the northern wind, the green fire of the aurora rippling silently across the top of the world. Let these images drift past, dimmer and dimmer, as your breathing slows and your thoughts grow soft and far away. Let the great story sink slowly into the dark, the Northmen coming out of the sea onto the holy island, the dragon ships spreading across the coasts of Europe, the great army marching through England, and Alfred rising from the marshes to save his kingdom, the ships rowing up the rivers of France, and the founding of Normandy, the Russ on the rivers of Russia, and the long road to the golden great city, the Nars crossing the wild Atlantic to Iceland, to Greenland, to the shores of a new world beneath the western sky. Let it all grow soft and dim and far away, like a tale half heard at the edge of sleep, as you sink deeper into the warm dark. Let the gods and the heroes fade gently now into the night. One-eyed Odin on his high seat, his ravens whispering of all the worlds, red-bearded Thor with his hammer riding the thunder, the great tree Yggdrasil holding the 9 worlds in its branches, ancient and green and ever-living, the fire and the ice meeting in the void at the beginning of all things, the doom of the gods at the end, and the green new earth rising washed and fresh from the sea, with bright Baldr returning and the world beginning anew. Let them all drift past you now, dimmer and softer, the whole magnificent cold and beautiful dream of the Norse, fading gently into the dark as you let go, and rest, and sink toward sleep. There is nothing now to hold, nothing to think, nothing to do. The voyage is over. The ship has come home through the dark water. The sail is furled, the oars are still, the long sea is quiet, and the green fire has faded from the sky, and there is only the warm dark and the slow rhythm of your breathing, carrying you down, softly, gently, into deep and peaceful sleep. You have sailed the whole length of the Viking age, and now you may rest. Let your breath grow slow, let your body grow heavy and still, let every thought grow quiet and dim, and let the cold grey sea, and the dragon ship, and the green fire in the northern sky carry you the rest of the way down, into sleep, into rest, into the deep and dreamless dark. If you have journeyed with us through the whole of this long voyage, and these tales have helped to quiet your mind and carry you gently toward rest, you might let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what story you would like to hear next on these long nights. What people, what age, what far-off shore. Subscribe, if you wish, and these quiet voyages through history will find you again on the nights when you cannot sleep. But none of that matters now. Now there is only rest. The ship is home. The sea is calm. The long story is told, and the night is yours. Sleep well, traveller. May your rest be deep, and your dreams be gentle, out beyond the cold grey sea, beneath the silent green fire of the northern sky. Good night.